Mithridates VI of Pontus was legendary in his own time, not only for his numerous wars against Rome, his crazy family life, and his rumoured immunity to poisons, which we'll get to, but also because everything about him screams, "I am the main character." In her biography of the king, historian and folklorist Adrian Mayer quantifies Mithridates' main character syndrome. She uses a model called the mythic hero script, a set of criteria that basically measures how much of a mythic hero someone is. Here it is. As you can see, there's a few classics in there, like a prophecy of your birth, signs that you're favoured by the gods or having important parents, and also a few more obscure ones, like dying in an elevated place and having more than one recognised grave. All the fan favourites score pretty highly. You can see near the top you got the guys like Moses, Cyrus the Great. A little bit further down you get the likes of Jesus of Nazareth and King Arthur. And then a bit further down from that you get like the Buddha, Robin Hood, Harry Potter, things like that. Why not have some fun finding out your own mythic hero score? It's pretty tricky to do because a fair few of the criteria require you to have died first, but it can still be done. No matter what you get though, I bet you won't beat Mithridates, because he gets a perfect 23 out of 23. He is the archetypical mythic hero. Literally the man, the myth, the legend. But the turbulent life of the historical figure that is Mithridates isn't quite as clear-cut as the simple hero's journey that most of these other characters fall into. He was brutal, ruthless, and ultimately unsuccessful, but he was also cunning, impressive, and in some ways quite likeable. So join me today in this fairly long video exploring the life and legacy of one of Rome's greatest enemies, and how what he did in his life forever changed the world that he lived in. Mithridates was born a prince of Pontus, this little country here in the northeast of what is today Turkey. And like most royals, past and present, he was born to a family of inbred freaks. His dad, Mithridates V Euergetes, was the product of two cousins. His mother, Laodice, who was related to his father, was the product of two siblings. But this level of inbreeding wasn't what made Mithridates unique in the eyes of most people at his birth. Mithridates was literally born under a meteor, a great shooting star that lit up the night sky, meaning that pretty much as soon as he came into this world, he was presumed to have been marked by destiny for a life of greatness. The idea that an unusually bright star would herald the arrival of a saviour king wasn't unusual in that time and place. In fact, there is a very famous example, and one still recognised today, in Christian beliefs. The bright star that shone under the stable in which Jesus was born that led the three wise men to him. But to Mithridates' people, this star probably reminded them less of the coming of the Jewish Messiah and more of the Iranian beliefs that were common in their land. In Persian mythology, the birth of the sun god Mithra was accompanied by a great fire in the heavens, so the baby was named Mithridates, meaning sent by Mithra. Shortly after all of this, the young prince was struck by lightning in his crib. Now he survived, but he was left with a permanent scar on his forehead in the shape of a crown. Now this all might sound a tad convenient. A modern, sensible, cynical person might rightly question the truthfulness of these stories about the young Mithridates. But we have to remember that these are ancient people that we're dealing with here. Greeks, Persians, Romans, the whole lot of them were superstitious to a degree that would make a modern person appear mentally ill. The significance of portents and signs were just a part of their worldview. This was a world in which major political decisions, battle strategy, big life choices were decided by the colour of cow livers and the alignment of the stars. The ancient world was a place where curses, magic, and all kinds of other mad stuff were uncritically believed by basically everyone except a bunch of fringe weirdos. All of this is to say that if Mithridates really was born under a meteor, which he almost certainly was, and if he really did survive being struck by lightning, he and those around him would have taken that extremely seriously. Especially when you consider his ancestry. Mithridates was descended from the Achaemenid dynasty, kings like Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, who had ruled over the great Persian Empire of old. And he was also related to the guy that brought that empire down, the ancient world's very own literally me meme, Alexander the Great. Those are some solid gold genes for an ancient king. But despite all this, Mithridates' path to power would not be simple or easy. When he was about 15 years old, his presumably quite comfortable life as a royal prince came crashing to a halt when his father, Mithridates V, began to choke at a royal banquet. Within minutes, the king was dead. This put Mithridates in a fairly perilous position. His father was dead and had almost certainly been poisoned, and suspect number one was fairly close to home. Mithridates' mother, Laodice, was for some reason or another not her son's biggest fan. She favoured her younger son, confusingly also called Mithridates. The teenage prince was in danger. His mother had probably already done away with his father, and now he was the only thing standing in the way of her putting her favourite son on the throne. He needed to escape. One day, the young Mithridates and a small group of closely knit friends went hunting. Which wasn't at all unusual. Mithridates was known to enjoy a good hunt with his friends. But this time, when they disappeared into the woods, they didn't come back. Many of them just assumed that their teenage king was dead. His infant younger brother was put on the throne, his mother became regent, and everyone in Pontus just got on with their lives. Little did they know that the young Mithridates was actually engaged in a rad training montage. He was sleeping rough in the woods, hunting wild animals on foot, and travelling Anatolia as a nomad, which acts as a great framing device for us to explore the world that Mithridates was born into and would one day rule. Because to understand the man that Mithridates would become, we have to understand how the world shaped him. So let's leave the bookcase behind, travel to the other side of the room where I have an off-white wall, and explore Mithridates' world. This is Anatolia, a great big lump of land wedged between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And for ancient peoples, it was a very desirable place to live. It's rich in natural resources, timber forests, mineral deposits, and great agricultural land. And all of this earned Anatolia a reputation as a place of great wealth. It's the home of the mythical king Midas, who turned everything that he touched into gold. In more grounded history, it was also the homeland of the Kingdom of Lydia and its king, Croesus, a man so rich that he basically invented money. Rich as Croesus, people used to say, and some still do, a testament to the man's wealth being so obscene that his name basically became synonymous with opulence. When thinking about Anatolia between the death of Alexander the Great and the birth of Mithridates about 200 years later, I like to think of the 3 Ds. Firstly, dynamic. Nothing stays the same for any length of time in Anatolia. The politics of the land are ever changing. Places would fall under the sway of one great power and then another. New kingdoms rose and then fell. Mithridates' own homeland of Pontus was a product of this. It had fought its way into existence during the collapse of Alexander's empire. Pergamum and Bithynia were 2 other kingdoms that had started as lowly Greek cities and come to control vast areas of territory. These new kingdoms clashed with the old and with each other in an ever-changing environment of shifting alliances and minor wars. Secondly, Anatolia is diverse. It's a land of many peoples, many cultures, religions, and languages. We've already mentioned the Persians, whose fallen empire still cast a very long shadow over the lands it used to rule, and the Greeks, whose colonies and cities dotted the coastline. But there were also Phrygians, Cappadocians, Lycians, Armenians, and dozens of others. Around the time of the first kings of Pontus, a Celtic people called the Galatians had migrated into Anatolia, so we can add Celts to this melting pot as well. This diversity was encouraged by Anatolia's geography. It had long coastlines and a mountainous interior divided up by great lakes and rivers that made certain areas of it very difficult to access and kept people who lived only a few miles apart separate from each other. It also acted as the bridge between east and west and north and south. Anatolia was right in the middle of everything, and ancient trade routes brought people from all four corners of the known earth to its cities. And thirdly, Anatolia was deadly. It was not a safe or secure place for anyone, but especially for royalty. Dying of old age was a rare privilege for kings in Anatolia. Battle claimed some, poison claimed even more. Mithridates' own father was not at all unique in that he died of something spilled into his cup. To be a king at this time and place in history was to play a dangerous game, with potential enemies and no shortage of ways of dying around every corner. And these were the lessons that a young Mithridates learned during his youth and his travels. The mere fact that he had fled his life as a prince and his palace to live as a rugged nomad in the mountains of Anatolia was proof that he understood that he would never be safe as a member of the Pontic royal family. These years living as a nomad also taught him a lot about the land that he would one day rule. Throughout his entire life, Mithridates displayed an intimate understanding of his kingdom and how its geography and its territory could be used to his advantage. He also honed his linguistic skills. By the time he was an adult, Mithridates was said to be fluent in 22 languages, which allowed him to communicate with all the people of his diverse homeland without the need for a translator. And this would really add to his great appeal as a king. He knew how to respect other cultures and to learn from them, to use their strengths, and in return be respected by them and accepted as their overlord. But all of that is for way off in the future. At this point in our story, Mithridates is still a teenager, and far from being king, he can only sit back and watch as a new power asserted itself over his homeland. One of the many success stories of Anatolia was the small Greek city of Pergamum, which had risen to become a powerful and wealthy kingdom, a center of scholarly works, learning, entertainment, and culture. The great library of Pergamum was the only one in the world that could hope to rival the Library of Alexandria. Pergamum's intellectual life was famous. Even their king, Attalus III, was a scholar. He was fascinated by medicine and by botany, and he spent his life experimenting with the various uses of plants that he grew in his garden. But for all of his scholarly achievements, Attalus III had failed to secure the future of his kingdom. In 133 BCE, he died without any children. So in his will, he bequeathed the kingdom of Pergamum to the Empire of Rome. Now, Rome was very much the new kid on the block. In the last 70 years, their empire had exploded in size, and they were the new power in the Mediterranean. Attalus likely thought that with no clear heir, his kingdom would descend into chaos after his death. So he gave it to the Romans to secure its safety and its security, which turned out to be a terrible mistake. Attalus may have had no children of his own, but he did have a half-brother by the name of Aristarchus, who declared that actually, no, he was the real king, and he was going to be the great Sun King, and he would rule from his new city at Heliopolis, and all of his loyal subjects would be the Sun citizens, and he was going to create this egalitarian utopia where everyone was equal, and there would be no slaves because he would free all of the slaves, and there would be no insecurity and no financial doubt, and no abuses of aristocratic power because he would forgive all the people's debts. The Romans did not appreciate this at all. Back in their own city, a young tribune by the name of Tiberius Gracchus was zealously campaigning for land reform, and he saw the bequeathment to Pergamum as a great piggy bank that he could dip his hands into and fund his ideas. So the Romans marched an army into Anatolia to defeat and kill Aristarchus, which they did very easily, actually. But the Sun King's ideas did not die with him. Very few slaves had taken up Aristarchus's offer of freedom in exchange for support, but many of the rural poor had. They were kept under the thumb of the local aristocracy, the landowners and the nobles, through a system of debt bondage. So when Aristarchus promised to forgive all debts and relieve all financial burdens, he won their undying support. As a result of this, even after the Romans had beaten Aristarchus and he was dead, the people of his kingdom refused to accept their new Roman overlords, and so the legions used biochemical warfare against them. The Romans were led by Manius Aquilius, a cartoonishly evil consul, who poisoned the wells that supplied the native towns and cities with their drinking water. This killed rebel and innocent alike. And then, once the rebellion was truly crushed and stamped out, Aquilius started extorting all of the locals for their wealth. When he returned home, Aquilius's brutal mismanagement of the new Asian province got him prosecuted. But he'd become so rich off of his corrupt governorship that he basically bribed his way out of any consequences. And from there on out, the people of the new Roman province of Asia suffered hideously at the hands of their new Roman masters. The most obvious atrocities were committed by the slave traders, as per usual. Rome's need for labour at this time required an immense quantity of human chattel to make their way to Italy, and there were many willing to make an absolute fortune facilitating this. The once sacred Aegean island of Delos had been taken by Rome and transformed into a massive slave market, distributing captives across the new empire. Within 3 decades, the Romans had stripped much of West Asia of its population. In 104 BCE, they sent an appeal to the kingdom of Bithynia, asking for men to join the legions so that they could defend Italy against invading tribes. But the king of Bithynia responded that he had practically no free men left in his kingdom to give. They'd all fallen into debt and been enslaved by the Romans. Along with the slavers came the publicani, Rome's business class. These guys would bid for contracts from the Senate to collect taxes in provinces. Whoever promised to raise the highest amount of money would get the job and get to keep whatever extra they made. As a result, these guys had every incentive to squeeze every penny they could out of Rome's new subjects. They had made huge promises to the Senate to get the job, and they needed to make extra on top of that because that was their profit. The Senate, which was untainted by direct involvement in this, also had no reason to discourage it. These guys were bringing in immense revenues. Of course, corrupt publicani could always be prosecuted back in Rome, but the courts were made up mainly of their colleagues, who were unlikely to condemn a friend of theirs for a crime that they were probably also committing. Together, the publicani and the enslavers plunged Anatolia into a spiral of horror. The publicani would rinse the locals dry with taxes. They would fall into debt, and they would be forced to sell themselves or their family members into slavery. Now, neither taxes nor slavery were new to Anatolia, but this was on a whole new scale. So the Romans had made themselves very unpopular with the Anatolians through high taxes and the slave trade. But even the nobles, the wealthy and the aristocrats, who didn't have to fear that kind of stuff happening to them, grew to dislike them. The Romans were honestly just quite rude. Anatolia was ruled during the Hellenistic era by absolute monarchs, by kings who wore purple finery and golden diadems and were covered in jewelry and things. But the Romans had kicked their kings out centuries ago. These Republican Romans had no time for the pretensions of royalty, and they often came across as being openly hostile even towards their own allies. In one famous story, a Roman ambassador met with the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, and he was there to ask the king to withdraw from his war with Egypt. The king, quite reasonably, said that he would need time to think about it, but the Roman senator took his walking stick, drew a circle in the sand around where the king was standing, and said, "You will not move from that spot until you give me an answer." So this was the world that young Mithridates was born into, and the one that he explored during his years of exile in the wilderness. One that was already rich in history and culture, being impeded on by the growing power of Rome. And with all that in mind, let's return to our young prince. While he was away from home, Mithridates was likely presumed dead. His younger brother was technically king in his place, but he was still a child. Real power lay with his mother, Laodice. For about 5 or 6 years, Laodice ruled Pontus from her new capital city, which she named Laodicea, after herself, and she likely assumed that her eldest son would never return. So you can imagine her shock when one day, out of the blue, she receives news that Mithridates has reappeared in the old capital of Sinope. Mithridates had left his home as a boy, and he returned as a grown man. He was tall, he had a strong build, and he had the haircut. He had that iconic haircut, those medium-long locks that reminded everyone of Alexander the Great. He looked every inch a king, and this probably contributed to his coup being relatively easy. His mother and brother, who had been in power for years, were unable to stop him. They were captured, and then very conveniently they both dropped dead at the exact same time. In the world of Hellenistic royalty, you couldn't trust anyone, not even your own family. As long as his younger brother was alive, he would remain a rallying point for those who opposed Mithridates' right to rule. And his mother, who was suspect number one in the death of his father, well, if Mithridates didn't get rid of her, she would most certainly do the same to him first chance she got. With remarkable speed and ease, Mithridates had assumed the throne of his ancestral kingdom, and all it took was a little bit of fracture and matricide. He was now the undisputed king of Pontus, and a king needs a queen. So Mithridates took his own sister, named Laodice after their mother, as his new wife. This wasn't particularly unusual. In Syria and Egypt, it was relatively normal for Hellenistic monarchs to marry their cousins, their siblings, and on one particularly odd occasion, their step-parents. And, in old Persia, full-blooded siblings were often married in order to preserve the purity of the bloodline. I know, it's really fucking weird, but reading this history is like watching House of the Dragon. You just got to accept the incest and move on. So Mithridates had married one of his sisters, but he still had 3 more to deal with, which was a little bit awkward. If Mithridates' sisters grew up to marry, have children, or, live their lives, their potential sons and husbands could end up being rivals to Mithridates for power. So his sisters were dangerous to him. He could always kill them, like he'd done to his mum and brother, but that was risky too. His marriage to Laodice might end up producing no children, and if that were the case, he might need to take a new wife to produce a legitimate heir. So getting rid of all of his excess sisters at once might prove a bit short-sighted, in case he ever had to marry one of them. So, like a fairy tale villain, Mithridates locked his sisters away in a tower, or more specifically in the remote fortress of Cabira, where they'd never be allowed to leave, and they would never be able to produce children who might one day threaten their brother. Mithridates had been brought up in a cruel world, and he himself was capable of acts of immense callousness. He had stormed back into his homeland and killed, married, or imprisoned any of his family members that might have gotten in his way. But I don't want to paint him as being a complete psycho who felt nothing for his family at all. He was ruthless, that much is for sure, but he was capable of love. He was very, very affectionate towards his daughters, for example, of which he had quite a few, and they seem to have shared this feeling with their father. His daughter Cleopatra, for example, will play an important role in her father's later life and always be quite loyal to him. He had another favourite daughter called Dripatini, who, shame, she was an unfortunate girl. She had multiple rows of teeth, like a shark, which isn't really a surprise, I guess, given the amount of sibling and cousin marriages that it had taken to produce her. I hate to keep bringing it back to the incest stuff, but look at these Habsburgs. Look at what happens to your family after a few generations of never marrying outside it. Look at these absolute disasters. They don't even look like people anymore. This is the kind of thing that's on the table when you do royal inbreeding for long enough. And given that that's the case, I think it's honestly surprising that Mithridates looks as normal as he does. I mean, he's no catch, don't get me wrong. He's no Sulla. He doesn't have those sharp cheekbones, he doesn't have that jawline, he doesn't have that harsh, steely glance that makes Sulla so... Where was I again? Oh yeah, his family. Mithridates' family woes would continue to follow him throughout his early reign. War was on the horizon. The ever-fragile status quo of Anatolia was under immense strain, and Mithridates had to prepare. So he organised a covert fact-finding mission to go out into Anatolia, look for weaknesses, look for strengths, and look for allies. And I think that time living as a nomad in self-imposed exile was a really formative time for Mithridates. I think he really enjoyed it. I think he looked back fondly on those memories of being free as a bird, without the stresses of being king as a young man. And I think he spent a lot of time nostalgically longing for a youth spent in the wilds. That would at least explain why, when the king needed someone to travel incognito into enemy territory, he refused to delegate. He did the job himself. I'm being serious. Only a few years after coming back from self-imposed exile, Mithridates disappeared without a trace again. And his mission was so super secret that he had neglected to tell basically anyone about it. In the sudden and mysterious disappearance of her brother/husband, Queen Laodice found herself ruling as regent. And as weeks became months and months became years, she grew quite used to ruling in her own right, and everyone else began to presume yet again that Mithridates was dead. So Laodice became comfy ruling. She became quite good at it. She'd been queen for a few years, and she'd even begun sexual relationships with a few of her brother's old courtiers. But sadly, the party would all come crashing to an end when, yet again, her brother just turned up out of the blue with no warning and expected to just be king again. Laodice probably realised that the amount of power she'd personally accrued for herself, not to mention all of those affairs that she'd had, would probably come to light soon and would probably lead to her sharing the same fate as the mother she was named after. So she wanted to be one step ahead. She started plotting to kill Mithridates. But Laodice did not have her husband's knack for intrigue. She got her servants involved on the assassination plot, which turned out to be a fatal error, because they informed on her to Mithridates. And so Laodice joined her mother and brother in death at the hands of her husband. Mithridates would not remarry for several more years. He didn't need to. He had legitimate heirs now, and he also had a harem full of concubines giving him less legitimate heirs. His sisters were locked in a tower, and his sons were all too young to pose a threat to him. We'll return to Mithridates' turbulent family life later on in his reign. For now, the war that had inspired his second mission into the wilderness was brewing, and the king needed to stack the odds in his favour. Mithridates ruled over a large and wealthy kingdom, but for a descendant of Alexander the Great and Cyrus of Persia, it obviously wasn't enough to just be a king. He wanted to be king of kings, and to do that, he would need an army. The standard Hellenistic army looked something like this. You have the old-fashioned phalanx in the middle, dudes packed closely together with 16-foot pikes. Then on each side you have the cavalry. The phalanx would pop over to the enemy line and start fighting them. Then you give them the old 1-2 with the horsemen, bing bang bosh, you're a conqueror. Mithridates' army probably looked a fair bit like this, but he had added a couple of new elements and brought back some old ones. Scythed chariots, for example, a relic from the days of the old Persian Empire, reappeared in Mithridates' new force. The Persians had kept the chariot relevant in the age of the cavalryman by making it bigger and bulkier, and attaching long spinning blades to the wheels. Mithridates' new army was flashy, unique, and grand. They wore armour that was coated in precious metals, they wielded weapons encrusted with jewels, and they were led by their king, who rode a chariot pulled by 16 horses. Pretty impressive. But did they work? Would they carry Mithridates to world conquest as Alexander's army once had, or would their efficacy end when they left the parade ground? Well, in their first field test, they performed pretty well. Mithridates' first conquest was of the northern Black Sea, modern-day Crimea and the Sea of Azov. The ancient sources don't really go into detail as to how he did this, which is a real shame because it's honestly one of Mithridates' greatest achievements. I mean, he managed to bring into his kingdom the Greek cities of the coast and the Sarmatian and Scythian tribes that lived inland on the steppe, which is quite the thing. I mean, just ask Cyrus of Persia or King Darius of Persia how difficult it is to deal with Scythians. But despite this, Mithridates' true ambitions lay in his homeland of Anatolia. His father, Mithridates V, had controlled far more territory than he now did, but it had slipped out of the control of Pontus during the regency of his mother. Mithridates wanted to win it back. So he made a deal with King Nicomedes III of Bithynia, and he schemed to annex the small but important kingdom of Cappadocia. Mithridates and Nicomedes picked their timing well. Both of them knew that Rome, in her arrogance, wouldn't allow either monarch to build powerful empires that might one day threaten their own. Luckily, at the time, the Romans were in no position to stop either of the kings. They were bogged down in a pretty horrific war in North Africa with the Numidian king Jugurtha, and migrating tribes were threatening Italy itself. The legions were too busy to worry themselves with the politics of far-off Anatolia. Mithridates planned to seize Cappadocia with the help of his sister Laodice. Not the one he married, that was a different sister called Laodice, also not to be confused with his mother Laodice, who died alongside Mithridates' brother, also called Mithridates. I swear more people would be into this history if everyone didn't have exactly the same name. Alright, brace yourself, it's going to get a bit confusing. Laodice was married to the king of Cappadocia, but with a little bit of encouragement from her brother, she murdered her husband and put her son, Mithridates' nephew, on the throne, which was perfect for Mithridates because his nephew was only a child and therefore an easily controllable puppet. For all intents and purposes, he was the king of Cappadocia. Except it wouldn't be so simple. Nicomedes, that sneaky snake, secretly married Mithridates' sister behind the king's back. Now he is the boy king's puppet master. Not to worry though, because for all of his scheming, Nicomedes does not have an army powerful enough to stand up to Mithridates' massive military. So the Pontic king simply sweeps into Cappadocia, deposes his nephew, and puts a different nephew in charge. All sorted, except for the fact that this new nephew turned out to be not such a great puppet. Now, he was only a child, but somehow being made king of Cappadocia put ideas in his head. He was under the impression that he would get to, rule as king, and he refused to listen to kind old Uncle Mithridates. So Mithridates has to go back into Cappadocia, but this time he's not going to put a nephew on the throne. He's got a son of his that he's going to put on the throne instead, who might not actually be his son. It's more likely that this child was a product of one of his sister's affairs from when he was away. But he's rapidly running out of child relatives to make puppets out of, so for all intents and purposes, this kid is his son and also the new king of Cappadocia. But this coup wouldn't be quite so easy. The boy king had gathered an army that very almost rivaled Mithridates' in size, so the king might have to fight a risky battle this time round. The two armies lined up for a fight, but neither side was confident that they would win, so when Mithridates suggested that they negotiate, a meeting was organised. So the boy king of Cappadocia and Mithridates king of Pontus, along with their companions, met in the no man's land between the two armies. As was probably customary, everyone was searched to make sure that they didn't have any hidden weapons. But when the attendant who patted down Mithridates got a little bit too handsy with it, the king chuckled and said, "Careful, you'll find a very different weapon if you search me there." The attendant backed off quickly, and everyone laughed a little bit nervously, and the meeting was underway. And at some point, Mithridates turned to his nephew and said, "What I'm about to tell you is only appropriate for the ears of kings. It's not right that these attendants and these guys here should hear what we have to say. We need to talk in private." So the two kings walked a few paces away. Then, fast as lightning, Mithridates whipped out a knife that he'd concealed in his underwear and slit his nephew's throat. Dumbfounded and completely leaderless, the young boy's army stood down, and Mithridates could bring out his 8-year-old son and proclaim him king of Cappadocia. Mithridates had won the war with only a single casualty. Clever, right? Well, yes, it is. Callous and cruel? Also that, yeah. Quintessentially Mithridates? Spot on. It's a shame then that it didn't really work. The Cappadocians got home, thought about it for a bit, and were like, hang on, you can't do that. You can't just kill our king before the battle has even started. That's not fair. And they revolted. And Mithridates had to go all the way back to Cappadocia for a third time to put down the rebellion. And so his empire grew yet further. But it hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd hoped. What was meant to be a brief and basically bloodless coup, supported by his ally Nicomedes, had turned into this protracted and confusing drama in which all of Anatolia had gotten involved. and he had failed to fly under the Roman radar. His first rebuke came from none other than the greatest Roman leader and military genius, Gaius Marius, who visited Anatolia at some point in the 90s BCE and went to the court of Mithridates for a brief and informal chat with the king. And no one knows exactly what they talked about, although I'm sure it would have been a great meeting to be a fly on the wall in. All we know is the Roman's parting remark. He turned to Mithridates, looked him in the eye and said, "Either seek to be stronger than Rome, or do her bidding." Then a few years later, that whole chaotic mess over Cappadocia, the nephew killing, the battles, the betrayal of Nicomedes, was rendered completely pointless by the arrival of a new Roman governor. A young Lucius Cornelius Sulla had made it to Asia, and he wanted to make a name for himself. And he did this by deposing Mithridates' puppet king of Cappadocia, putting a new king in charge, and in doing so, taking it from Mithridates' empire and bringing it into Rome's sphere of influence. It was now clear to Mithridates that even if he never personally attacked the Romans, he would be forced into an inevitable conflict with them. Either that, or sit back and watch his lands be whittled away until he was no more than a client state in the orbit of the Roman Empire, as Cappadocia now was. War with Rome was now inevitable. Mithridates' first attempt at empire had been foiled by the Romans, but things never stayed the same for long in Anatolia, and a new opportunity would present itself for him in 90 BCE. Mithridates' old ally turned rival, Nicomedes III, had finally died, and he left the throne of Bithynia to his young son, Nicomedes IV. But his father's failed efforts had left the young Nicomedes at the head of a bankrupt and divided kingdom that lent heavily on Rome for support. And Mithridates exploited this. The old king had a half-brother called Socrates the Good, who many felt had a better claim to the Bithynian throne than Nicomedes IV did. So Nicomedes married Socrates to his own daughter Alcibiades, and then he gave his son-in-law a large army and told him to go into Bithynia and assert his right to be king. Soon, pretty much the whole country was hailing Socrates the Good as the new king. Almost the whole country. The capital city of Nicomedia was still held by Nicomedes IV, and Socrates couldn't rightfully call himself the king of Bithynia as long as this was the case. And this brought the young king just enough time to appeal to his only remaining friends, the Romans, who would surely come to the aid of their client king. But yet again, Mithridates had picked his timing well. Rome was in no position to help her allies. In Italy, a dispute over who got to be a Roman citizen and who didn't had snowballed into a massive conflict right in Rome's back garden. They simply did not have the troops to go and intervene in some Anatolian dispute. But that doesn't mean that they didn't try. They sent a man called Manius Aquilius to Asia with the task of restoring order. But they didn't send an army. They barely even sent a legion. There weren't any troops to spare, so Aquilius had to throw together a ragtag team of mercenaries and allies and just do the best he could with what he had when he got there. And Aquilius was a terrible choice for the job. You might remember another Aquilius from part 2 of this video, the one who stamped out the last remnants of Aristarchus's rebellion by poisoning wells and terrorizing the locals. Well, this is that Aquilius's son. The people of the region still remembered how this guy's father had brought a horrific Roman vengeance down on them and their communities only a few decades ago. And this might be part of the reason why the Romans chose him for the job. They might have thought that, like his dad, he would brutally but swiftly end any troubles. But it would turn out to be a huge and grave error. By the time Aquilius arrived in his dad's old stomping ground, the problem that he'd been sent to solve had kind of solved itself. Socrates the Good had dropped dead, his wife-to-be, Alcibiades, had gone back to Pontus, and it seemed like Mithridates had given up on interfering with Bithynian royal politics. Aquilius easily restored Nicomedes IV to the throne, and then he turned to him and said, "Right, we've given you back your kingdom. You owe us." Aquilius demanded an absurdly large reward for the help he'd given the young king. But the invasion had left the kingdom in shambles, and Nicomedes just didn't have anything to give the Roman. "Not to worry," said Aquilius. "I know Mithridates is very rich, so why don't you gather up your army, go into his territory, steal his stuff, raid and pillage, and then come back and give it to me?" So was Aquilius just being greedy here? Quite possibly. He was by all accounts his father's son, whose main purpose in being in the region was to get as rich as possible, but it might be also that he was trying to provoke a war with Mithridates, and a war with Mithridates would be great news for his patron, Gaius Marius. Nicomedes, whose homeland would be the front line in any coming war, was probably less enthusiastic to poke the Pontic bear, but he didn't really have any choice in the matter. He just had to do what the Romans told him, so he gathered up what army he could, and he made his way into Pontus to start raiding. And this all went very well for Nicomedes. There was plenty of wealth to be taken, although not as much as he'd expected, certainly enough for his men to raid, loot and pillage and have a good time. The Pontic army was nowhere to be seen. The Pontic navy wasn't on the horizon. There was no one there to stop him. Like, no one at all was trying to stop them. Maybe a few farmers to drive from their fields, and the occasional old priest yelling from his temple, but other than that, the lands of Western Pontus appeared to be bizarrely depopulated, and this must have caused some mixed emotions. I mean, if he wanted to, Mithridates could descend from the hills with his massive force and swat Nicomedes like a fly. So in many ways it was probably a bit of a relief that the king was nowhere to be seen. But on the other hand, if he could so easily drive the Bithynians from his territory, why didn't he? Why is it that Nicomedes could go further and further into Pontus without so much as a stone being thrown at him? Where was the army? Where was the king? Mithridates, ever the sneaky snake, knew all about Nicomedes' little incursions into his territory, and he saw it not as a threat, but as an opportunity, because he was preparing for war, but not with Bithynia, with Rome. To win a fight with the Romans, Mithridates would have to unite the peoples of Anatolia, and what better way of doing that than by allowing Aquilius to indulge in his rapacity for loot for a little while. Soon the victims of Roman aggression and Roman greed would come flocking to the banners of Mithridates, the only man willing to stand in their way. Mithridates had spies everywhere, so he knew that Nicomedes was coming to his territory to raid and pillage. So he sent word to the border towns to give the population enough time to flee to safety, and he left behind just enough riches to draw the Bithynians further in, whilst taking most of his country's wealth and hiding it in the fortresses that dotted Pontus. He then started the war of words and letters. He sent envoys to the Romans being all like, "What's all this then? You've sent an army to come and pillage my lands? That's a bit out of order. Remember that I am technically an ally of Rome. Is this any way to treat a friend?" Predictably enough, the Romans just kind of shrugged the complaints off. But that was okay. Mithridates knew that they would never be won over with diplomacy. This was just a stalling tactic. Whilst his ambassadors spoke with the Romans, other messengers went to his allies and friends around the Black Sea. Soon, Scythian and Greek mercenaries were boarding ships to Pontus. In the meantime, Mithridates himself went east to meet with Tigranes of Armenia. This handsome fella here. Now, Tigranes, like Mithridates, had big ambitions to build his small kingdom into a mighty empire, and both he and Mithridates recognized that they would have an easier time doing this if they worked together. So Tigranes married the daughter of Mithridates, a daughter called Cleopatra, and the two men became both allies and family, and agreed to support each other. And then it all came down to Cappadocia, that pesky little kingdom that had caused Mithridates so much bother. The deal they made is that Tigranes would go and invade Cappadocia, and he would get to keep anything he captured whilst there. Riches, goods, people to be sold into slavery, but Mithridates would get to keep the actual land. And unlike the first time he tried this when Nicomedes had betrayed him, this time it worked. Tigranes was good to his word. He stormed into Cappadocia, took everything he wanted, and then handed it over to his new father-in-law. With everything settled at home and with a powerful new ally, Mithridates was ready to fight. He sent his messengers back to the Romans, but this time they had a very different tone. They said, "How patiently King Mithridates bore injury from you when he was deprived of Phrygia and Cappadocia not long ago. What injuries Nicomedes inflicted upon him you have seen, and have not heeded. And when we appealed to your friendship and alliance, you answered as though we were not the accusers, but the accused. You therefore are accountable to the Roman Republic for what has taken place in Cappadocia. Mithridates has done what he has done because you disdained us and mocked us in your answers. Come now, if at last the consequences of your acts have put you in a better frame of mind, either restrain Nicomedes from injuring your friends and allies, or throw off the mask of friendship for us, or let us go to Rome and settle the dispute there." The Romans were left to reel from those sick burns, and in the meantime, Mithridates' main boys were closing in on the overextended and overencumbered Bithynian army. One day, the young king Nicomedes IV woke up to see the sight that he had been dreading, the full force of the Pontic army bearing down on him. Speaking of, it's time I introduced Mithridates' boys, his main dudes, his dream team. No man rules alone, and Mithridates is no exception. So here they are. To start with, we have his longtime friend and constant companion, Dorilaus, who commands the infantry phalanx of the army. Then we have two mercenary brothers, the general Archelaus and the admiral Neoptolemus. And commanding the Pontic cavalry, we have Mithridates' son, who might not have actually been his son, the new king of Cappadocia and only a teenager, Arcathius. These guys, working together, smashed into the Bithynian army near the river Amnias, and initially Nicomedes held them off. That was until, according to Appian, the scythe-bearing chariots made a charge on the Bithynians, cutting some of them in two, and tearing others to pieces. The army of Nicomedes was terrified at seeing men cut in halves and still breathing, or mangled in fragments and their parts hanging on the scythes. Overcome rather by the hideousness of the spectacle than by the loss of the fight, fear took possession of their ranks. While they were thus thrown into confusion, Archelaus attacked them from the front, and Neoptolemus and Arcathius, who had turned about, assailed them in the rear. They fought a long time, facing both ways. After the greater part of his men had fallen, Nicomedes fled with the remainder to Paphlagonia, although the Mithridatean phalanx had not come into the engagement at all. His camp was captured, together with a large sum of money and many prisoners. All these Mithridates treated kindly, and sent to their homes with supplies for the journey, thus gaining a reputation for clemency among his enemies. Nicomedes had lost basically all of his army, and he went running back to the Roman camp, right into the arms of Manius Aquilius. Aquilius responded by marching his legions out to face Mithridates. Well, I say his legions. It's not really a Roman army. Outside of the leadership, there are very few Romans in it. It's mostly just mercenaries and allies that he picked up along the way. And there really aren't that many of them, especially when compared to Mithridates' huge army. And this is a fact that only seems to have dawned on Aquilius once he'd already marched out and seen the size of Mithridates' force. According to Appian, at this point, Mithridates commanded 300,000 men, and even given the tendency of our ancient sources to exaggerate these kinds of things, I think it's fair to say that the Pontic army was huge, and Aquilius' response was not. Realizing too late just how outnumbered he was, Aquilius tried to hightail it out of there, but Mithridates outmaneuvered him, caught him on two separate occasions, and destroyed the legions. Aquilius himself then tried to save his own skin. He tried to escape back to Italy, but Mithridates had spies everywhere, so he didn't get any further than the Greek island of Lesbos before he was apprehended and delivered to the king in chains. Mithridates had done it. He had driven the Romans from Anatolia, and his great Black Sea Empire now stretched from the Caucasus all the way to the Aegean. Now he just needed to bind it together, permanently. We've seen in Mithridates' life so far just how changeable the politics of Anatolia could be. Kingdoms swayed this way and that according to the prevailing winds, and a friend could very easily become a deadly enemy at a moment's notice if they felt it was to their benefit. We've also seen just how ruthless and brutal Mithridates himself could be in his pursuit of security in this insecure world. The murder of so many close family members is a testament to that. But what he did next after capturing Lucullus would outdo everything else he ever did in its sheer cruelty. In 88 BC, shortly after winning his new empire, Mithridates dispatched messengers to the cities of Western Asia. To prove their loyalty to their new king and to permanently sever their ties with Rome, they had to, on a select date, massacre the entire Italian populations of their towns. And it's important to emphasize how well organized this was. There was a specific time and date, and when that day came, the day that would go down in history as the Asiatic Vespers, the people of these cities descended on their Latin-speaking populations and wiped them out. The writer Appian provides plenty of grisly details of Italians who ran to the temples of the gods looking for sanctuary, who pleaded for their lives, all to no avail. By arrows, by fire, by sword, and by drowning, the Italian population of West Asia was annihilated in a single day. The body count at the end was high. One of our writers say 80,000 died, another goes as high as 150,000. And again, I'd like to emphasize that this was all in one day. For a rather grim comparison, here are some other large death tolls from single days in more modern history. As you can see, Mithridates' genocide of the Asian Italians is rivaled only by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, when it comes to sheer numbers of dead. So what was this horrific act in aid of? Well, one of our sources tell us that this was because Mithridates feared that the Romans living in Asia would act as fifth columnists, working to bring his kingdom down from within. Appian tells us that such was the awful fate that befell the Romans and Italians throughout the province of Asia. Men, women, and children, their freedmen and slaves, all who were of Italian blood, by which it was made very plain that it was quite as much out of hatred of the Romans as fear of Mithridates that impelled the Asiatics to commit these atrocities. So a mix of hating Romans and fearing Mithridates? Well, the fear factor certainly worked. Rome's allies began deserting in droves after the massacre. But I think one of the other main purposes was to unify his new realm. Participation in this immense crime would permanently sever the ties that these cities had to Rome, and prevent them ever, forging another alliance with them or getting any Roman goodwill. On top of that, it forced them to turn to Mithridates, who was the only power in the region other than the Romans who might protect them from retribution. The king himself would participate in the massacre in his own symbolic way. Whilst his subjects dealt with the regular Italians, he would deal with the most hated of them all. Manius Aquilius, the hated Roman governor, was paraded across West Asia on the back of a donkey, until he arrived at Pergamum, where he was taken up to Mithridates, who rebuked him for his greed and his arrogance, and then poured molten gold down his throat. Which for a man as obsessed with money as Aquilius is as poetic as it is distressingly brutal. Aquilius died in irony as well as in agony, although poetic justice, it turns out, is about as unlikely to be what actually killed him as being burned by gold. According to this article I found, when you have molten gold, or any molten metal I imagine, poured down your throat, it's not the burning that kills you, it's the steam. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know this for sure, and sadly no one who's ever died from this method has stuck around long enough to tell us exactly what it was that killed them. But either way, from burns or by steam or by the poetic justice of it all, Aquilius died. Mithridates stood at the height of his power. Rome was weak after years of war and political turmoil. It was time for him to push even further. In 88 BCE, he made a politically advantageous marriage to a woman called Monime. Now, initially the king had been fairly hesitant to take a new wife. His last marriage had ended badly, and he didn't really want to give a new woman the level of power that allowed his previous spouse to very almost overthrow him. But Monime herself refused to just be another mere concubine in Mithridates' great harem. She wanted to be queen, and that was a deal breaker. And eventually Mithridates relented, and she became the new queen of Pontus. Where exactly this new queen was from is a little bit uncertain. Different sources give her different home cities. But we can say with relative certainty that she was from one of Mithridates' new territories, and that she came from a prominent, noble Greek family, which would come in very helpful with Mithridates' new plans. For his next conquest, he would take the spiritual heartland of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Aegean and mainland Greece itself. Mithridates was pen pals with a relatively prominent Athenian politician called Aristion, who may have actually been two different people, but who cares? At some point, Aristion says, absolutely, we in Athens are 100% on board with becoming a part of the new Black Sea Empire. And Mithridates thinks, great, and he sends his general Archelaus across to mainland Greece with an army to secure it for his rule. When the Pontic army arrived, the cities of southern Greece positively fell over themselves to declare their undying loyalty and love for Mithridates. Or at least the smart ones did. The ones who put up any resistance at all very quickly found their cities demolished, sacked, and burned. Archelaus had very quickly won much of Greece for Mithridates' cause, but the king wasn't present to celebrate with them. He was back in Asia, dealing with the last vestige of Roman support there. When Mithridates had ordered his new subjects in Western Asia to massacre the Italian population of their towns, most of them had obliged and obediently gone about this grim task. Pretty much all of them, apart from the tiny island of Rhodes. Rhodes had remained loyal to Rome, and had even accepted refugees of Italians who had managed to escape the mainland. The island now stood as the single stronghold in the region against the power of Mithridates. Which all sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? I mean, Rhodes is only little, and Mithridates' empire is enormous and can call on vast resources and manpower. This would be like if a world superpower with an enormous military like the United States, for example, was defied by a tiny island nation like, I don't know, Cuba or something like that. But Rhodes had good reason to be confident. Their island was a fortress. In 305 BCE, the Macedonian king Demetrius attacked the city. He was called Demetrius Poliorcetes, or the Besieger, and with good reason. He had built some dauntingly impressive siege machines, a battering ram that took 1,000 men to operate, and a siege tower that stood at a record-breaking 125 feet tall, named the Taker of Cities, which isn't very creative, but it didn't need to be. It was huge. If anyone could take the island, it was him. And he failed. Despite the resources and expertise that he could wield against the Rhodians, their city stood firm and forced Demetrius to leave defeated. After their victory, the Rhodians melted down the bronze from the siege machines that Demetrius had abandoned to build a great statue of Helios, the Colossus of Rhodes, towered over the port like a great message to the world that said, you can't get in unless we invite you. So Rhodes had a fearsome reputation. But so did Mithridates, and he was dead confident after his early and easy victories, so he set sail to capture the island. Initially, things looked pretty hopeful for the king. Mithridates commanded an enormous navy that could cut the island off, and a fairly decent-sized land force. He also had his own enormous siege contraption, called the Sambuca. Not that kind of Sambuca. This is a siege tower, which was sailed up to the enemy walls on 2 ships, where archers would be able to fire down on the defenders, and it could deposit a couple of well-trained fighters on the walls. Before long, bing bang bosh, the city's yours. But the Rhodians turned out to be experts at using their smaller force to prevent their city from falling. On land, they used kind of guerrilla tactics to prevent Mithridates' relatively small army from setting up a proper siege. The king had to send for reinforcements from the mainland, who would take weeks to arrive. And at sea, the Rhodian admiral Demagoras knew exactly how to wreak havoc amongst the Pontic fleet. He would sail out late in the day, with only an hour or 2 of sunlight left, and he would use his small and agile vessels to draw Pontic ships into a chase, where he could isolate and destroy them. And then, before the enemy could retaliate, night would fall, and the battle would be ended. The Rhodians, who knew these waters well, could easily navigate their way back to port in the dark, but the Pontic fleet, which was in very unfamiliar territory, would get confused. One of these skirmishes very almost killed Mithridates himself. During a night attack, the king led his flagship out and tried to coordinate a battle in the dark, yelling orders this way and that, when suddenly, bang! An enemy ship slammed into his and very almost sank him. The king survived, and he found out that the enemy ship was actually one of his allies, part of the contingent sent from the island of Chios. And they were very apologetic. They were so sorry. They were like, oh, it was dark, and we got the flagship confused with the enemy. We really, really didn't mean it. Isn't fighting at night time a nightmare? And Mithridates accepted their apology and their explanation. Or at least he said he did. Deep down he wondered if perhaps the Chians weren't quite as committed to this cause as they said they were. Then, disaster struck again. Mithridates' reinforcements, the ones who he planned to land on the island itself so that he could overwhelm the city with numbers, got caught in a storm. Now most of them survived, but the chaos had left the fleet scattered and disorganized, and seeing an opportunity, the Rhodian admiral Demagoras took his fastest ships and raced out to attack them. Mithridates' reinforcements were largely transported by merchant ships that had been requisitioned by the king. They weren't warships, and scattered and all over the place, they had no chance against the actual military vessels that the Rhodians brought out to bear against them. Mithridates' reinforcements, therefore, found themselves either sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean or hauled back to Rhodes as prisoners of war. This was a massive blow, but Mithridates is not done yet. He still has a fairly large fleet, a decent-sized land force, and those massive siege machines he's built. If he's clever, he can still take the city. Rhodes was large, and the locals couldn't fully defend all of the walls at once, so Mithridates planned a secret double blow. His naval forces and his massive sambuca would attack the port walls. When the assault was underway, he would light a signal fire on a nearby hill, and his land forces would spring into action. They would silently approach a pre-selected section of the walls, an area that Mithridates judged weak enough to fall by storm. The surprise attack would quickly overwhelm the defenders, and the city would fall. Mithridates' men lay silent with their grappling hooks and ladders, ready for the signal to attack. Then they saw it. A fire in the exact place that they expected the signal to come from. All together they let out a great battle cry and rushed the walls, where they were promptly massacred. The Rhodians knew all about Mithridates' plan. They knew which section of the wall he was going to attack, and they knew that he would signal it with a fire. So they manned that section of the wall, they lit a fire of their own to trick the Pontic army, and they lured them into a slaughter that lasted all night. The assault on the harbour fared no better. The sambuca, the enormous siege tower, the marvel of military engineering, collapsed under its own weight. Later, the Rhodians would claim that the goddess Isis could be seen from the walls during the assault, and that she hurled fireballs down on the machine and the Pontic navy. But personally, I reckon it's just a bit more likely that Mithridates' engineers were a tad overambitious when they built the thing. This was the point that Mithridates despaired of ever taking the city. The autumn of 88 BCE was very almost over, and soon winter would prevent him from resupplying his troops or maintaining a proper blockade. So with the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth, the king withdrew from the island. But the bad news did not end there. Word came from Greece bearing troubling news. The Romans had finally arrived. You might have noticed that so far Mithridates' great war against Rome hasn't actually involved fighting all that many Romans. I mean, sure, there was Manius Aquilius's ill-fated venture into Asia, but that hardly counts. So where have the Romans been this whole time? Well, the answer is that things in Rome have been a right mess. The Social War, which was a war against their own allies in Italy, had only just wrapped up for the Romans, and their politics were in complete shambles. Now, everyone agreed that Mithridates had to be dealt with, but there was a fair bit of debate over who would get to be the guy to deal with him. Every important Roman wanted command of this war, because it was a sure path to riches, glory, and legacy. The official choice was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who you might remember as being the guy that took Cappadocia of Mithridates a few years back. But a lot of other people reckoned that Gaius Marius should be the fella in charge. You might remember Marius as being the guy who told Mithridates that he should either seek to be stronger than Rome or do her bidding. And if you want to know more about Marius and Sulla, I've already done videos on the both of them. This argument over who would get to command the legions had gotten so out of hand that eventually Sulla turned his army around and became the first Roman in history to march against his own city. Now this had sorted things out somewhat, but it had delayed him significantly. But finally, in 87 BCE, Sulla arrived in Greece with 45,000 men, and immediately most of those Greek cities that had literally just declared for Mithridates changed sides and swore their undying loyalty to Rome. Again, Archelaus decided to make Sulla come and get him, so he fortified the city of Athens and its port, the Piraeus. Much like the war for Rhodes, this would all revolve around the siege of a city, only this time it was the Pontic army defending the city and the Romans trying to get in. So let's have a look at how that will go. Unlike Rhodes, which is a port city, Athens is a city and a port. Two centres separated by about 6 kilometres and connected by a corridor called the Long Walls. Archelaus can resupply himself and the city using the port and these walls. Initially, Sulla attempted to take the port by force, but Archelaus had prepared for that. He had built ring after ring of defences, forcing the Romans to take wall after wall after wall. No matter how many times he tried, Sulla could never penetrate further than the outer fortifications. Archelaus would also try and sally out and break the Roman siege lines. These attacks saw some success. The Pontic army could burn Roman siege works and disrupt the whole affair. But these were Roman legions, and if there's one thing that they do extremely well, it's build things. Every time Archelaus burnt a tower or a catapult, it would be replaced within a few days. The first few months of the siege were characterized by this indecisive back and forth. Sulla could neither take the city by force nor starve Archelaus out, and Archelaus could not break the siege or decisively beat Sulla. Ancient sieges are honestly just so interesting, especially ones like this one where Appian and Plutarch give us a fair bit of detail as to what was going on. You know, it's just so clever the ways that they were constantly trying to get one over on each other. Like, at some point, Archelaus has guys dig underneath the Roman siege lines so that they can collapse the siege equipment and destroy it. And Sulla realizes that he's doing this, and he has guys trying to tunnel underneath the walls of the Piraeus so that he can collapse them. And worst of all, sometimes these two tunnelers run into each other, and then they have to fight in what must have been the most nightmarish battles of the whole siege. Like claustrophobic subterranean brawls in the darkness. It must have just been awful. Sulla's men also use a kind of ancient grape shot where they fill their catapults with 20 small lead balls and then fire them at high velocity towards the enemy, which must have just shredded defences and anyone unfortunate enough to be in the way. Now, I've no idea how accurate or effective these kind of catapult shotguns would have been, but damn, it's cool. By the time the winter of 87 BCE set in, both sides were in a bad way. In the Piraeus, things were looking pretty bleak for Archelaus. Sulla had used his catapults to demolish those long walls connecting him with the city of Athens, and until recently he'd been able to resupply the city using secret nighttime missions. But in the last few weeks, all of these missions had started being discovered, ambushed, and captured. It was as if the Romans knew whenever he was going to make a move. The same was true of his assaults on their siege works. They seem to have wised up to Archelaus's tricks because he could never catch the Romans unawares anymore. His last few sally-outs had actually been kind of disastrous. At one point he tries to assault the Roman siege works, and it just goes so horribly wrong, and Archelaus himself is very almost captured. Someone has to throw a rope down from the wall and pull him up quickly before the legions can get him. Bad news had also arrived from the rest of the empire. Mithridates had been forced to withdraw from Rhodes. Archelaus's own brother, Neoptolemus, had been wounded in some minor fighting in the northern Aegean, and a reinforcement army, led by Mithridates' young son, the 18-year-old Arcathius, had come to a crashing halt when the young prince died of camp fever. The whole Greek campaign had devolved into chaos, and here Archelaus was, trapped in the port of Piraeus, unable to break the siege. And things really weren't that much better in the Roman camp. Sulla received word that his political enemies had seized power in the city of Rome again, and were at present purging his political supporters. Refugees from Italy arrived in his camp every day with worse and worse news about the deaths of Sulla's friends, the confiscation of his property, and he had been declared an enemy of the state. And this just made it even more infuriating for Sulla that there was no end in sight for this pesky siege. I mean, some things had gone well. Sulla had managed to recruit some Athenian slaves to act as spies. Whenever Archelaus tried one of his super sneaky supply missions to Athens, or an attack on the Roman lines, he always knew about it in advance. The slaves would find out, write it on a little note, wrap that note around a lead ball, and then sling it into the Roman camp, which is pretty clever. But he still couldn't starve Archelaus out. The Piraeus is a port, and the Pontic army controlled the sea because Sulla had no navy at his disposal. So he turned to one of his subordinates. A few months ago, when Sulla had marched his own army against the city of Rome, he had committed a terrible sacrilege. There was a reason that no one had ever done this before him. It was basically an unforgivable crime. So great was the magnitude of this offence that to a man, Sulla's staff and officers had refused to join him. All except one young man called Lucius Licinius Lucullus, which, what a name. Like Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Imagine being called Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Anyways, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who we'll just call Lucullus, had the one trait that Sulla valued most in his subordinates. He was unflinchingly loyal, so it was to him that he trusted this next task. Lucullus was to go out and brave winter storms and hostile waters and find Sulla a navy. But Lucullus would be gone for weeks, and Sulla did not have the time to just sit around and wait for him to come back. He had to make a move against the city. So he decided to take aim at the weaker of the two targets, the actual city of Athens. Cut off from their port and therefore their supplies, the people of Athens had begun to starve. First, they ate all the animals in the city. Then they ate their clothes, and then eventually they ate each other. And the hearts of the Athenians really weren't in this fight. I mean, sure, their chief official, Aristion, was a stalwart ally and friend of Mithridates, but he was kind of the exception. The resolve of the Athenian people as a whole was weakening. So in the hopes of maybe gaining a little bit of sympathy and hopefully preventing a brutal sack when all of this was done, a delegation of the city's nobles went out to meet with Sulla. And they explained to him that, Athens was a great city, rich in history and a place of great culture and heritage for the Greek people. It was the city of Theseus, the great hero who'd slain the Minotaur, and it was the birthplace of democracy, that greatest of institutions. And it had stood at the forefront of the war and resistance against the mighty Persian Empire that had dared to invade Greece and been turned back. Did you know that Sulla cut them off? He lost patience with the delegation and he told them, "Be gone and take your speeches with you. For I was not sent here by the Romans to learn of Athens' rich history. I was sent here to subdue its rebellion." When Sulla assaulted the walls, he met very little resistance from the starving Athenians, and he took the city easily. He sacked it and pillaged it, and he beheaded Aristion, who tried to mount this futile last stand on the Acropolis, but he didn't burn it. Maybe the delegation got through to him a little bit, because he refused to completely destroy the city. But Athens was lost, and Archelaus, with no city to hang around and defend, abandoned the Piraeus. The war in Greece was turning against Mithridates, and back home, his own people were doing the same. Mithridates had fallen a long way since his initial victories in 88 BCE. The honeymoon was very much over, both for his empire and for his marriage. After 2 years with Monami, the king had grown distant from his wife, and she eventually left his court. Stewing in Pergamum, the king was forced to reckon with disaster after disaster. Athens was lost, and after Archelaus had abandoned the city, Sulla had pursued him north, and at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Romans decisively beat the Pontic army. And I mean like they totally wiped them out. Only 10,000 of the 120,000 men under Archelaus' command got away. The Roman losses are somewhat dubiously measured at 12 guys missing, which, I mean, even given the penchant of our ancient sources to exaggerate these kinds of things, it's fair to say that the Battle of Chaeronea had been a crushing Roman victory. It was followed by the Battle of Orchomenus. Mithridates sent his general Dorilaeus to restore the situation in Greece with 90,000 men, and this time the Pontic army fared far better. The battle was so close that at one point a desperate Sulla ran out in front of his men, putting himself in serious danger, and yelled, "If you are ever asked, Romans, where you abandoned your general, say that it was here at Orchomenus." And that is how Sulla single-handedly won the battle with his own bravery and charisma. Very cool, very impressive. Definitely what actually happened, and not a product of Sulla's later propaganda. Either way, Greece was lost. This second battle really was the last nail in the coffin. The Pontic army suffered horrendous casualties, and Archelaus' own son had fallen along with most of the aristocratic cavalry that comprised the elite of the Pontic army. It was now very clear that even with their massive numerical superiority, the Pontic soldiers just weren't equipped to stand up to Roman legionaries in conventional battles. Beset on all sides by disaster, Mithridates started looking around for someone to blame. There must be some reason why all of his most recent ventures had ended in catastrophe. Who were the traitors who had allowed Sulla to starve Athens? How was it that the defenders on Rhodes had known about his strategy to attack the city secretly? And remember that time that one of his own ships had accidentally rammed into his flagship and almost killed the king? Well, Mithridates had been thinking about that, and he'd been thinking about whether or not the Romans were in fact his worst enemy. Perhaps his own people were the ones working against him. The Galatians, especially, had never seemed quite as dedicated to the cause as perhaps they should have been. Those pesky Celts have always had divided loyalties. You can never tell what they're thinking. Mithridates' increasing paranoia led to him inviting all the leading Galatian aristocrats to a great banquet, and then he massacred them Red Wedding style, which actually happens quite a lot in history, like more often than you'd think. If I was like an important king, aristocrat, or general, I would just never accept an invite to dinner. But alas, Mithridates didn't get all of them. 3 of the Galatian chieftains survived the conspiracy, and they fled back to their own lands, and unsurprisingly, raised them in rebellion against their murderous overlord. Mithridates then dispatched a small force under the command of a general called Zenobius to the Greek island of Chios. And when Zenobius arrived, he assured the locals that they had nothing to worry about, nothing was amiss here. Mithridates didn't intend them any ill harm. It's just, in light of recent events, certain loyalties had to be secured. But it's okay, nothing drastic. Mithridates is just going to take all the arms and armour out of the city for the war effort. And a couple of aristocratic children are going to go back to Pergamum as, well, hostages is a really ugly word. Guests, there'll be guests. Yeah, Mithridates wants guests. The Chians obliged and hoped that that would be the end of it. But then a letter arrived from Mithridates that read, "You favour the Romans even now, and many of your citizens are still sojourning with them.
You are reaping the fruits of Roman property, of which you do not make returns to us. Your trireme ran against and shook my ship in the battle before Rhodes. I willingly imputed that fault to the pilots alone, hoping that you would observe the rules of safety and remain my submissive subjects. Now you have secretly sent your chief men to Sulla, and you have never proved or declared that this was done without public authority, as was the duty of those who were not cooperating with them. Although my friends consider that those who conspire against my government and who intend to conspire against my person ought to suffer death, I will let you off with a fine of 2,000 talents.
The inhabitants of Chios, an island famous in antiquity for its slave trade, were themselves enslaved as a punishment. Which from our modern perspective sounds a bit like poetic justice, the enslavers being enslaved. But to the ancients this was a cruel and calamitous act by the increasingly tyrannical Mithridates, and one that betrayed his paranoia. But if any of you guys happen to be like hardcore Chios stans, don't worry. According to the account of Memnon of Heraclea, the Heracleans, the people of his native city, carried out a daring rescue and saved all the Chians. So there's that. Mithridates' actions against Chios did not prevent rebellion. They actually inspired more of it. When Zenobius arrived with the small army at the city of Ephesus and told them that they had nothing to worry about, Mithridates didn't intend them any harm. It's just, in light of recent events, certain measures had to be taken, so you need to give up all your arms and armour and some children as hostages, yada yada yada. The Ephesians didn't fall for it. They killed Zenobius, seceded from Mithridates' empire, and raised rebellion. All up the Aegean Sea, Greek cities began abandoning Mithridates. And to make matters worse, the Romans now had a navy of their own. Lucullus had returned from his mission with a large donation from the king of Egypt, which he used to purchase an enormous navy, which he was now using to take the islands of the Aegean for Rome. At this point, the penny with a comet on one side of it and his own face on the other finally dropped from Mithridates. It was over. There was no more that he could do. He couldn't hold the Romans back. Hell, he couldn't even hold his own empire together anymore. It was time to make an end of the war, so he sent word to Archelaus and told him to make peace with Sulla on the best terms possible. But as it turns out, even surrendering would not be straightforward, because Sulla was no longer the only Roman in the region. Sulla's enemies back in Rome had seized power in the city and declared him a criminal, meaning that his whole command was technically illegitimate. So the Roman Senate sent out a new army, which was the official response, to take over the war against Mithridates. This new army was smaller and far more chaotic. This second army had left under the command of Lucius Valerius Flaccus, which was the Senate's chosen replacement for Sulla. But at some point along the way, the soldiers themselves, who didn't really get along with their commander, decided to shake things up a bit, and they murdered their general, replacing him with a man called Fimbria. So now both of the Roman armies in the region are technically unaligned with the Senate and commanded by renegade generals. While Mithridates was trying to surrender to Sulla, Fimbria had a bright idea. He could undo the crime that he'd committed by killing his superior officer and taking command if he used that command to capture Mithridates. If he did that, he would undercut Sulla's strategy, overshadow everything he'd done in Greece, and return to a city that would be forced to hail him as a hero. So he marched quickly to Pergamum, surprised Mithridates, and trapped him in the small coastal town of Pitane, where he laid siege to the king. Fimbria was relying on the possibility that he could capture Mithridates before Sulla could make a proper peace with him, and that looked quite likely, especially when a Roman navy appeared on the horizon. It was Sulla's lieutenant, Lucullus, arriving with his navy, and recognizing a fellow Roman, Fimbria jumped for joy. "Come and join us," he said. "If you blockade the port and cut off his escape, I'll take the town and capture Mithridates, and we'll both go back to Rome as heroes." But Lucullus was loyal. He was also a proud aristocrat who hated the populare cabal that had seized power in Rome in Sulla's absence. So, in a move that betrays just how much the civil war in Italy had infiltrated this war in Asia, Lucullus ignored Fimbria. So, ironically, Mithridates' salvation came at the hands of his enemy, Sulla. When he arrived with his much larger army, Fimbria was forced to retreat and negotiations could begin. Mithridates and Sulla finally met, and for a little while they just stared at each other in complete silence. This was a power play. In negotiations of these types, it was usual for the guy in the weaker position to speak first. But Mithridates, despite the fact that he had, well, lost, just kind of stood there as if to say, well, what have you brought me out here for then? Sulla broke the awkward silence by reminding Mithridates that it is the part of suppliants to speak first. Victors may remain silent. So Mithridates began to defend his actions. This wasn't his fault. Rome had wronged him. They had played favourites with the kings of Anatolia, and he'd never wanted this war. It was out of self-defence. He'd been driven to it out of necessity because of Roman rapacity. Sulla cut him off. He'd heard it all before. Oh, being the subject of a big terrible empire is so horrible. Oh, the Romans took my land and they enslaved my peoples. Oh, boo-hoo. Oh, cry me a river. Do you think Sulla cares? You think this is news to Sulla? Yeah, Rome is a big terrible empire that destroys everything it touches. Welcome to the ancient world. By which Sulla meant, welcome to the real world. And whilst we're on the subject of crimes against each other's peoples, didn't you massacre 80,000 Italians in an orgy of bloodletting when you took power? Didn't you enslave the population of Chios on the mere suspicion that they might betray you? And what's with this trying to paint yourself as a liberator against evil empires? Being all like, oh, look at me, I'm Mithridates, I'm the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, here to liberate you all from Rome, yada yada, and then enslaving any Greeks that don't agree to join you. My brother in Apollo, you are the imperialist power. You aren't liberating people from an evil empire, you're just building your own one.
I am astonished that you should now seek to justify the acts for which you asked pardon through Archelaus. If you feared me at a distance, do you think that I have come into your neighbourhood to have a debate with you? The time for that passed when you took up arms against us, and we vigorously repelled your assaults, and repelled them to the end.
I love Sulla. He's so delightfully impatient, like a proper no bullshit type guy. Sulla was not willing to entertain the idea that this was a negotiation. It was a surrender. He gave Mithridates terms. Mithridates could either accept them, or he could sit back and watch as the legions burned, pillaged, and destroyed everything on their way to Sinope. So Mithridates took the deal, which really wasn't a bad one when you consider the scale of the war that he'd waged. Typically speaking, Rome doesn't make peace. Rome makes deserts out of those who oppose her. So with that in mind, the terms of this peace were actually very generous to the Pontic king. Mithridates had to pay some reparations and give up a large chunk of his navy, but it was really chump change when you consider the sheer wealth of the king. Other than that, Anatolia was largely restored to its pre-war status quo. The borders were put back roughly how they had been in 89 BCE, there was a general amnesty declared, and a real vibe of let's just get back to normal could be felt. Why was Sulla so lenient? Well, mostly he just didn't care anymore. Italy was in the hands of his enemies. He just wanted to go home and fight his civil war already. So the terms that he drew up with Archelaus were the best option he had for ending this war quickly. So Mithridates and Sulla sealed the deal with a handshake and a kiss, which maybe the kiss was normal in these types of dealings, or maybe Appian got it wrong when he assured us that Mithridates was a purely hetero guy, and the icy good looks of Sulla finally got the better of him. We'll never know, and experts will no doubt continue to debate this for decades. And with that, Mithridates' great empire fell, and his wars with Rome were over. Only joking, this video is barely halfway done. And if there's one thing that we're going to learn about Mithridates in this second half, it's that he never gives up. True, for a few years there in the 80s and 70s BCE, it does look like he'd somewhat accepted his lot in life. Being king isn't all that bad, even if it's not quite the same as being king of kings. Mithridates was like 50 years old at this point in his life, but he was energetic as ever. His court was vibrant, filled with entertainment, music, art, and science. Lots and lots of science. Ever since the poisoning of his father when he was a teenager, Mithridates had been fascinated with pharmacology and toxicology. It's telling that despite all the interesting stuff that Mithridates did during his life, his main selling point, the thing that he is mostly remembered for today, is his supposed immunity to poisons. You know, forget the sister that he married and then killed, the empire that he built, the battles and the sieges. Forget all that stuff. It's all about the drugs, baby. One of the reasons for his supposed immunity may have been simple. Mithridates likely discovered when he was young something that the average drug user discovers today, that your immunity to toxins builds the more you ingest them. According to Pliny, Mithridates developed a habit of ingesting small amounts of common poisons every day to build up a natural immunity to them. This would have worked. Small doses of arsenic, for example, which was probably one of the most common poisons of the day, are relatively harmless, and over time the user will build a tolerance. And this certainly contributed to Mithridates' later reputation as being invincible, something which he likely encouraged himself. It's always helpful when you're a ruler to have people think that you're unkillable. Dissuades them from rebelling or trying to murder you. A certain degree of showmanship was involved in cultivating this reputation. Mithridates was known to impress guests at parties by drinking the venom of freshly milked vipers. He likely understood, as many did at the time, although many others did not, that viper venom is only deadly if it enters your bloodstream. You can drink it, no problem. You shouldn't though. You shouldn't do it, just in case. This channel does not endorse you drinking snake venom. But Mithridates' cynical fostering of awe in the face of ingesting essentially harmless toxins shouldn't overshadow his genuine interest in pharmacology. By all accounts, the king spent his entire life experimenting with different toxins and antidotes, trying to get to the root of how he could prevent himself from falling victim to them. He would test various poisons and antidotes on condemned criminals, something which was fairly common practice at the time. The Roman physician Galen praises another king for only ever testing his poisons on criminals, which suggests rather darkly that others tested poisons on the innocents rather regularly. But not content with just building an immunity, Mithridates also spent years perfecting the universal antidote. Hello, and welcome to my kitchen. Today I will be preparing Mithridatium for you. This recipe will not only taste delicious, but it will also prevent your enemies from dispatching you by means of a bit of sneaky poison. This recipe fascinated people for centuries, as they tried to recreate the formula that allowed Mithridates to drink arsenic like it was coffee, and I will show you. Speaking of coffee, that's where we're going to put our first ingredient, cinnamon. Smells like Christmas. With that out of the way, we will start immunizing ourselves with today's first ingredients, garlic and saffron. Saffron especially was a key ingredient and would have been readily available to Mithridates because it grew naturally in his homeland. But saffron is fairly expensive here in the UK, so I've substituted it with thyme, because I do not have the riches of Mithridates to fund my recipes. Mithridates' wealth seems to have been one of the few constants throughout his life. Despite his numerous defeats and costly setbacks, the king seems to have been able to draw on an almost unlimited supply of cash. A fair part of this might be due to the origin of our ancient sources. They are pretty much all Romans and Greeks, for whom the idea of Eastern monarchs having a huge amount of wealth was a little bit of a trope. Persian gold being the main weapon goes all the way back to the Persian Wars. But this stereotype didn't come from nowhere. As we've already established, Anatolia was a very wealthy location, and kings from the area tended to be fairly rich. And Mithridates was well placed to exploit this wealth. His kingdom connected east and west, and numerous trade routes would have run through it. He also controlled a fair portion of the Black Sea, which must have provided him with a steady income. The Greeks, who called it the Euxine Sea, had seen the potential of this region centuries ago and begun colonizing it. In time, they became reliant on it as a source of grain, other agricultural goods, and slaves. So even after his defeat at the hands of Sulla, Mithridates still controlled a powerful and strategically situated kingdom with a complete monopoly on the lucrative Black Sea trade. And he distributed the wealth that he attained from this throughout his country into hidden caches and various fortresses. That way it was never vulnerable to being discovered and captured all at one time. Access to trade with the north of the Black Sea would have also provided Mithridates with his next ingredient, rhubarb, which is thought to have been native to what is today South Russia. The Greeks have been using it as a food and medicinal plant for ages now. We actually get our word rhubarb from the Greek, barbarian ra, or ra barbaron, rhubarb. But I don't like rhubarb, so we're going to use basil instead. Mithridates also took this time to do a little bit of a reshuffle regarding who was close to him. Archelaus, for example, had not impressed the king with his conduct in Greece, which is fair, to be honest with you. If I gave a massive army to a friend of mine, and he allowed it to be wiped out by a force less than half its size, I would also be having stern words with that particular friend. But it had also been Archelaus who had negotiated the peace terms with Sulla, and from our perspective, the peace that Mithridates made with Sulla was a fairly generous one. But it seems that over time, Mithridates himself seems to have started to wonder whether or not he could have gotten a better deal. So we don't know exactly how, why, or when, but it seems that shortly after the First Mithridatic War, Archelaus left the king's service. But out with the old and in with the new is what I say. Mithridates might have lost one of his generals, but he'd gained some new wives. He was still married to Monime, that queen who he'd married before the First War, but she was off in Cabira, not talking to her husband. Mithridates was a man of large sexual appetites, and Appian assures us that, unlike many of his Macedonian forebears, he was a purely hetero dude. No time for doing it with other men, he kept a large harem of female concubines, who between themselves and his wives ended up producing over 20 little Mithridateses. He didn't call all of them Mithridates, by the way. I know that sounds like the kind of thing that he would have done, but thankfully for us, Mithridates had the good sense to give his children some original names. Although there are at least 2 Cleopatras, so he did double up on some of the daughters. Our next ingredient is a classic, opium. But opium doesn't really agree with me, so I've decided to substitute it out for olive oil, which is less addictive and better for you. Anyways, at some point in the late 80s BCE, Mithridates started looking around for some new wives. He married someone called Benorike, who was a Greek noblewoman from the island of Chios, the same Chios that Mithridates had enslaved after suspecting them of treachery. I bet Christmas was pretty awkward with that side of the family. Another one of his new wives that he married round about this time was called Stratonike, who won the king's heart through their shared love of music. He first laid eyes on her when she performed on the harp for his court, and Mithridates instantly took to her. He married her and showered her family with treasure. Our other ingredients include frankincense and myrrh, but I don't have either of those, so I'm going to use canned tomatoes. Another unusual ingredient from the time is soil from the Greek island of Lemnos. Lemnian earth was a valuable product in antiquity. It was a treatment for more or less anything. Nausea, headaches, snake bites, no matter what ails you, all you gotta do is simply head down to Lemnos, start spooning the mud into your mouth, and you will be cured. Was this just a local quirk or an ancient superstition? Well, quite possibly not. In 2008, some experts suggested that the island's volcanic soil contained various difficult-to-pronounce properties which are known to absorb toxins. So as an anti-poison measure, it might have worked. Now I've got neither the funds nor the desire to catch a flight to Lemnos and start eating their dirt, so I've substituted it with pasta. Mithridates' increasing age did not get in the way of his athletic pursuits. He loved to hurl javelins like the champions at the Olympic Games and go on long horse rides into the wilderness, some days riding so far and so fast that he required multiple horses for the journey. And this was a passion that he shared with yet another new wife that he took, a woman called Hypsicratea. Our sources don't mention exactly when Mithridates met Hypsicratea, and we only really know two things about her: that she was Scythian and that she was a warrior. Unlike in Pontus or Greece, it wasn't that unusual for Scythian women to fight alongside their men. The testimony of ancient authors, along with archaeological evidence by way of graves filled with weapons, show this to be the case. When he met Hypsicratea, Mithridates was likely reminded of the mythical Amazons, horse-mounted warrior women like Penthesilea, who fought with the Trojans against the Greeks, or Hippolyta, who loved and then was killed by Heracles. Plutarch tells us that she always displayed a manly spirit and bearing, wearing Persian clothes and never appearing tired or wearisome, even on long journeys. These were considered very masculine traits at the time, and it might be the reason why Mithridates took to calling her by the masculine form of her name, Hypsicrates. And a super cool warrior wife would likely come in handy soon, because Mithridates was planning to go back to war. Our antidote also includes salt, which the Roman writer Pliny mocked as being a little bit of a joke. And yeah, salt won't stop poisons, but it will make our antidote more delicious, and that counts for something. It's going to take me a little while to cook up this universal antidote, so we'll return to Mithridates and his immunity to poisons later on when it's ready. Mithridates was not content at peace. He never had been. The voice in the back of his head that told him that he had to live up to his ancestors and conquer the world hadn't gotten any quieter. But as we've already seen, when it comes to fighting the Romans, timing is everything. The full force of Rome's empire was just too much for Mithridates to stand up to on his own. He had to attack them when they were divided, distracted, or otherwise too busy to respond to him properly. But timing would not choose Mithridates. The Romans were watching him closely. When the governor of Asia noticed that Mithridates was rearming his military, he responded somewhat rashly by invading Pontus with the two Fimbrian legions. The Fimbrian legions were the two legions led by Fimbria that had very almost caught Mithridates at the end of the First War. Without any conflict to exploit, and knowing he'd probably be executed anyway, Fimbria did for himself soon after Mithridates made peace with Sulla, but his legions had remained in the area, and they'd been used to garrison the territory under their new commander, a guy called Murena. Mithridates responded to this invasion by sending envoys to both the Roman Senate and the Roman army, explaining that he had no designs on empire building. He didn't wish them any harm. He was just responding to a rebellion in the Caucasus. This is nothing to worry about. But the Fimbrian legions were hungry for loot, and Murena was hungry for his own shot at personal glory. So without the permission of the Senate, they continued their invasion. We're not going to go into the short and relatively inconsequential Second Mithridatic War here, because this video is already long enough, and there's not really that much to it. All we have to know is that Murena attacked Mithridates. Mithridates sent word to Rome being like, well, this is out of order, we've literally just made peace, why are you breaking the treaty? And then he defeated Murena at the Battle of the River Halys, a small but important victory for Mithridates. After his relatively fast fall from grace at the end of the First Mithridatic War, this little victory was a real confidence boost, and there were some people who were yet again hailing him as a liberator against Roman rule. Then Sulla got involved, this time to the king's benefit. He told Murena to stand down and just leave Mithridates alone. He was barely holding the Roman Empire together as it was, and the last thing he needed was some hot-headed subordinate reigniting a war in Asia for his own personal benefit. So yet again, Mithridates had benefited from Roman infighting, and that gave him an idea. Mithridates had been keeping a close eye on what was going on in Italy. After the end of the First War, Sulla had returned home, fought a 2-year-long bloody civil war, taken control of Rome, and made himself dictator, before enacting a bloody purge of his political rivals. Most of Sulla's enemies were captured and killed, but one notable rival managed to escape. The man in question was Quintus Sertorius, the most capable of the generals that had fought Sulla. He was no pampered aristocrat. He was a tough, experienced, one-eyed general. He was also a principled man. He had aligned himself with the Marian faction and against Sulla because he agreed with their politics, but when they sought to elect a 26-year-old as consul, he abandoned the cause out of protest and fled to Spain. By leaving the war early, Sertorius had managed to escape the purges and the manhunts that had claimed the lives of so many of his allies. In Spain, he had time to set up a splinter state to Rome. He raised his own senate, raised his own legions, and he successfully fought off any attempts by the empire to retake the territory. Then, in 80 BCE, Sulla resigned his dictatorship and went into retirement, and within 2 years of that, the man who had once crushed Mithridates was dead. So with the dictator gone and Sertorius ascendant, Mithridates began plotting to ride the wave of a second Roman civil war to his own victory. He sent 40 ships laden with silver to Sertorius with a proposition. Mithridates suggested that they join forces. He would attack the empire from the east, drawing the Senate's attention and the armies away from the west. Then Sertorius could attack and reunite Rome under his own power. Sertorius agreed, and he assured Mithridates that after his victory over the Senate in Rome, he would forfeit the empire's claim to Asia, and Mithridates would be able to retake his previous kingdom. He also sent 3 of his colleagues east to advise Mithridates, a general called Marcus Varius, and 2 statesmen called Fannius and Magius. With these Roman advisors, Mithridates went about rearming his military properly. He absorbed some of the difficult lessons of the First War. His army then had been a grand spectacle, vast in numbers, impressive to behold, but when it came to battle, they had performed disappointingly. They had completely failed to stand up to the legions. In the First War, he had drawn to his army men from all around his empire, and by doing so he could boast of the size of his domains. But in practice, this had caused more problems than it had given advantages. Colchian archers, for example, are fantastic in the Caucasus, where they can hide in the mountains and the rocks and the forests and do guerrilla warfare, basically. But when they were brought to pitched battles and sieges, they were really just more mouths to feed. So his new army was more uniform, less diverse and with fewer specialist troops, and with more guys armed specifically to do the kind of warfare that he would be fighting. His rigid Macedonian-inspired phalanx had been deadly, but slow and unmaneuverable. They often didn't even make it to the battle in time. So under the supervision of his Roman general Varius, these men were retrained to fight in smaller, more flexible divisions, in the same way that the Roman legions were organized. Mithridates also did away with his men's bejeweled armor. There would be no more gold-plated breastplates or emerald-encrusted sword hilts. That had done nothing to intimidate the enemy, and had only provided rich pickings for post-battle looters. Instead, his men were equipped with imitation Roman gladiuses and large shields. In many ways, this new army was built to resemble, as much as possible, his Roman enemies, except his cavalry. He kept his cavalry largely unchanged. These guys had always been his army's key advantage over the Romans. Big, heavy cataphracts, lightly armed Scythian nomads, and scythed chariots. With his new army and his new allies, Mithridates was ready for round 2. Technically round 3, but like I said, we're not going to count the Second Mithridatic War. He just needed the time to be as ripe as possible. In 73 BCE, the time was ripe. Sertorius's rebellion in Spain was still going strong and resisting all attempts to bring it back into the empire. In Italy itself, a gladiator named Spartacus had raised a slave army and was pillaging the countryside. And in Asia, King Nicomedes IV had died. Nicomedes IV, if you remember, was that young and weak king of Bithynia who had kind of started the First Mithridatic War by invading Mithridates' territory. Anyways, he died in 73 BCE without an heir, and he left his country to Rome. Plutarch describes this bestowal of an entire kingdom as being like a relapse for the people of West Asia, who until this point had basically resigned themselves to Roman rule. Now, suddenly, they looked to Mithridates again, and Mithridates obliged. He held a grand ceremony in which he sacrificed to Zeus. He then had his chariot pulled by 4 beautiful white horses driven into the sea, where they sank to the depths as an offering to Poseidon. Then he turned to his soldiers and promised them victory. His army cheered and followed their king as he led them personally through Bithynia. And just as had happened 15 years earlier, most of the cities threw open their doors and declared their undying loyalty to their new liege. The Roman governor, a guy called Marcus Aurelius Cotta, was caught completely unprepared, and he locked himself in the city of Chalcedon. But his commanders were a little bit more proactive. They decided to try and meet Mithridates' army with their own force. But this turned out to be a horrible mistake. Their army was blown through by Mithridates' cavalry and butchered within sight of the walls. A great start to the war. Mithridates had defeated the first Roman army he met and regained all of his old empire. Almost all of it. The city of Cyzicus was still holding out. So, not to worry, he should take that fairly easily. Mithridates marched south and besieged it. But this time, the Roman response would be far quicker. Lucullus, that old lieutenant of Sulla's, the one who had procured a navy for him during the First War, was on his way with a single legion. Just the one legion. And when he got to Greece, he hooked up with the Fimbrian legions, bringing the total size of his army to a little bit over 30,000 men, which according to Appian is about 1/10 of the size of the force Mithridates had. But Lucullus was a bold man. He knew that the majority of the legions were tied up either in Spain fighting Sertorius or in Italy fighting Spartacus, and so he whipped together whatever army was available and decided he'd just do the best he could. Even when the Senate offered him money to raise a navy, he somewhat arrogantly refused, saying that he would make do with what he had. When he arrived in Asia, his advisors, which included the defected Pontic general Archelaus, told him to bypass Mithridates. If he attacked him here, he'd be risking battle with a far more numerous foe. But if he went past Mithridates, he could attack Pontus and cut the king off. But Lucullus refused, saying that a hunter does not bypass a beast so that he can stalk his empty lair. He landed his army and made straight for Cyzicus and Mithridates. Lucullus had a problem though. His army was incredibly small, and Mithridates' army was very, very large. His advisors were right, any battle would be very, very risky. But Lucullus was a smart cookie. He realized that he could turn Mithridates' advantage into his main weakness, and he boasted that he would defeat the king not by shedding his blood, but by kicking his stomach. Mithridates' army was so large that it could not feed itself without a constant baggage train of supplies. So Lucullus simply occupied the high ground outside Cyzicus and began disrupting these supplies. And this led to Mithridates' army starving even faster than the inhabitants of the town that they were besieging. Mithridates might have been able to prevent this if he had taken action to stop Lucullus from taking the high ground outside the city. But his Roman allies, the ones sent to him by Sertorius, advised him against this. They said that the legions under Lucullus were disloyal, and that if he let the two lines get close enough, this would encourage defections. Soon, Lucullus's army would become his. Now, it might be that his Roman allies were mistaken. They might have genuinely thought that this would happen and just made a very, very bad judgment call. Although it's also possible that they themselves were looking for a way out. During the siege, word had arrived from Spain that Sertorius had been assassinated by his own men and his Spanish rebellion had crumbled. The cause that these Romans were fighting for was very much dead, and they were now just helping out some foreign king fighting against their fellow countrymen. So perhaps facilitating a quick Roman victory by advising Mithridates poorly was part of some plot to eventually go home and be pardoned. We'll never know for sure what their motivations were, we only know the consequences of their choice. Because Lucullus had cut Mithridates' army off from supplies, they began to starve, and as winter approached, disease spread through the camp. Mithridates realized that he would have to take the city quickly.
He had 3,000 prisoners rounded up, those who hadn't been fast enough to get to the protection of the city's walls before his men could capture them. He then had them sailed into the lake outside the city, so they were within view of the walls. He demanded that the defenders surrender, or he would butcher the prisoners. Upon hearing this, the captives began to weep and scream up the walls, begging for their friends and families to spare them and let Mithridates in. The defenders remained silent, until Pisistratus, their general, shouted back, "You are in the hands of the enemy now. Meet your fate bravely." Appian does not record whether or not Mithridates followed through and killed the prisoners.
Next, the king put his siege equipment to use. Towers came at the walls, battering rams attacked the gates, and catapults launched flaming projectiles into the city. And yet, the Cyziceans held. Despite their fear of these war machines, the heat from the fire, and the numbers of the enemy, it seemed that they were all determined to fight to the last.
3 times on the same day, all the machines on the landward side were massed against the toiling citizens, who flew this way and that way to meet the constantly renewed assault. They broke the rams with stones, or turned them aside with nooses, or deadened their blows with baskets of wool. They extinguished the enemy's fire-bearing missiles with water and vinegar, and broke the force of others by means of garments suspended or linen cloth stretched before them. In short, they left nothing untried that was within the compass of human zeal.
Oh, it's just like Rhodes all over again. Why is it that no matter what he does, Mithridates just can't get these damn Greek cities to just let him in already? Alright, desperate times, desperate measures. Mithridates simply doesn't have the supplies to keep feeding all of his men. It was time to send any unproductive mouths and stomachs home. His horses, for example. The most powerful arm of his military when it came to open battle, but useless in a siege. Horses can't climb ladders, and horses can't operate catapults. They were also taking up entirely too much fodder, and were becoming weak and emaciated. It was time for them to go. So Mithridates planned to load his wounded onto their remaining horses, and send them back to Pontus. This would give his remaining men a larger share of the dwindling rations.
The sick, tired, and injured men made their way on horseback through the mountains. Winter was now upon them, and the snow fell thick, obscuring vision and slowing their march. Then, out of the fog and ice, came Lucullus and the Romans. Caught by surprise and in no state to fight, Mithridates' men broke and ran, but a great river prevented their flight. Trapped between the Romans and the icy waters, they fell there, with nowhere left to run. Lucullus took 15,000 men and 6,000 horses prisoner.
This was the last straw. Winter was upon them, and the siege was lost. All Mithridates could do now was plan his escape. Mithridates' flight from Cyzicus was an absolute mess. The king and most of his army managed to get away by boat, but a combination of winter storms and Roman allies at sea meant that very few of them actually made it home. Amongst the casualties were Mithridates' main Roman advisor, Marcus Varius, who was captured by Lucullus and executed. Mithridates fled deep into his own country, buying himself time to regroup and come up with a new plan.
In the meantime, Lucullus had to fight his way through Pontus, besieging the king's numerous fortresses. Amisus, one of Pontus's major cities, put up fierce resistance. Stocked up on supplies, the confident defenders would drive the Romans from their walls whenever they made an assault, sallying out and challenging Romans to single combat to show their bravery. When he besieged Themyscira, Lucullus attempted to undermine the walls, a common tactic in sieges as we've seen, but the defenders found the mine and dug their own entrance to it. The Roman tunnelers, in cramped and dark conditions, suddenly found themselves contending with bears and swarms of bees, which had been released into the tunnels by the defenders.
Lucullus left a fair portion of his troops maintaining sieges in these various cities, whilst he took the bulk of his army and continued to hunt down the renegade king. News eventually reached the Roman camp that Mithridates had gathered a new army of 45,000 men at Cabira, a fortress deep in the heart of the Pontic Mountains. the same place that he had kept his sisters isolated for decades. When Lucullus arrived at Cabira, Mithridates endeavoured to take a little bit more initiative this time, more initiative than he had done at Cyzicus at least, and he attacked the Romans. In 2 separate skirmishes, his cavalry made short work of the legionaries that faced them. These were small victories, but they meant a lot to Mithridates. In one of these engagements, Mithridates actually captured the Roman cavalry commander, a man named Pompeius, and had him brought to him in chains. When he asked Pompeius what he would offer him in exchange for his life, the Roman somewhat cheekily said that he would happily accept the king's surrender, but anything less would be a deal-breaker. Apparently this boldness in the face of being executed impressed Mithridates, who spared Pompeius's life and kept him as a prisoner. There was a downside, however, to having beaten Lucullus but not crushed him. The Roman had retreated yet again into his cautious tactics. He had occupied high ground near Cabira and refused to come down from it. Mithridates didn't have the resources to attack this well-defended position, but he also couldn't draw the Romans away from it. So Mithridates tried 2 new tactics. The first was to do to Lucullus what Lucullus had done to him at Cyzicus, to kick him in the belly. So Mithridates sent his light and mobile cavalry around Roman lines to cut off their supplies. Then he sought to remove Lucullus himself from the equation. He enlisted one of his Scythians, a man called L.M.V, to go to the Roman lines, to pretend to be a deserter, to get close to the Roman general, and when the opportunity came, to eliminate him. Now Lucullus wasn't an idiot. Anyone couldn't just walk up to a Roman camp and insist on seeing the general. But over time, L.M.V managed to integrate himself with the Roman officers, and before long, he was sharing a table at dinner with the Roman commander. When he'd considered that he'd ingratiated himself enough to ask for some alone time with Lucullus, L.M.V approached the general's tent and assumed that he'd get a meeting without too much hindrance, seeing as everyone seemed to trust him. But by complete chance, Lucullus was having a nap when the Scythian arrived, and the guard outside the tent refused him entry. L.M.V tried to explain that he had very serious business to discuss as pertained to the war, but this just made the guard angry, and he continued to refuse him entry. The fierceness of this guard's refusal convinced L.M.V that he had been found out, so he hopped on his horse and buggered off. Lucullus was still asleep, but also very much alive. This was followed by yet more bad news. The cavalry that had been sent to wreck the Roman baggage train had met with disaster. They had attacked the Roman supplies, but they'd allowed themselves to get drawn into small battles on uneven ground. On the cragged rocks and steep precipices of Anatolia's mountains, Mithridates' men couldn't ride their horses safely or easily. The legionaries cut them down, driving some of them off cliffs and the rest of them in all other directions, running for their lives. A small number of the survivors managed to make it back to the Pontic camp, where they informed Mithridates of what had happened. To the king, this was the turning point. He clearly no longer held the upper hand, and he began making preparations to retreat to a more advantageous position. But his men saw it differently. A rumour had spread that the catastrophe with the cavalry was worse than it was, that there had only been 2 survivors, which was untrue, but they weren't to know that. So why was Mithridates acting like nothing was amiss? Can't you see his servants packing up his tent and loading his possessions onto wagons? Does the king mean to abandon us here? Is he sacrificing us to the Romans to save his own skin? Nobody knew what was going on, but the men of the army weren't willing to stick around to find out. In the dead of night, they began to flee. Mithridates woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the chaos outside, as his own men ransacked his camp, and his servants were butchered by men trying to get loot. He and his generals tried to restore order, but it was hopeless. Without royal garb, without diadem, and without attendants, an anonymous Mithridates was carried away by a panicking crowd. Dorilaus, his loyal general and companion, who'd been with Mithridates through all of this, threw his purple garb over his shoulders, his general's cloak of authority, to show the crowd who he was, and he tried to restore some order. But this was a mistake. There was no order left to restore, only desperate men. Desperate men who could save every penny they ever acquired in their long lives and still not afford a purple cloak. Dorilaus was slain for his clothing, along with Mithridates' high priest. The king was alone and without a horse, and the Romans, who heard the commotion, were closing in on the mob. Finally, someone recognized Mithridates. Two of his court eunuchs came along with a horse and saddlebags full of gold to help their king escape. Mithridates took the horse and thanked them. He then sent one of the eunuchs, called Bacchides, back in the other direction. He would have to provide one final service for his king before the night was over. As the Romans appeared, Mithridates kicked his horse into a gallop, but they were right on his tail, and they got closer and closer, until in desperation the king drew his dagger and stabbed one of the saddlebags behind him. A stream of gold treasures flew out of the saddlebags and littered the road behind the fleeing Mithridates. The Roman pursuers, given the option of capturing the king or his treasure, but not both, chose the treasure. Yet again, Mithridates had expertly exploited Roman greed. The king had escaped, but the same would not be true of his sisters or his wives, who would not have time to get out of Cabira before the Romans captured them. Dealing with them was the task of his eunuch Bacchides. Mithridates had ordered that his entire royal harem be put to death, so that they would not fall into the hands of the Romans. Bacchides told the women that they should choose their preferred method of dying and make it quick. Monime, the king's estranged wife, went first. She took off the diadem that marked her as queen and hanged herself with it. But the crown snapped under her weight, and she exclaimed, "Cursed bauble, could you not do me this one service?" At her request, Bacchides cut her throat. Benarice, Mithridates' wife from Chios, chose poison. But sadly there was only so much poison to go around, and her elderly mother refused to live longer than her daughter, so the two of them had to share the small amount of poison that they had. Now on the very, very old woman, this worked and she died very quickly and peacefully, but Benarice was left writhing in pain, and Bacchides, unable to watch it any longer, strangled her to put her out of her misery. Mithridates' two sisters, both middle-aged and having spent a lifetime in isolation, also chose poison. Roxana drank it down, whilst cursing her brother for having done this to them. But his other sister, Statira's dying words were, by contrast, in praise of her brother, that in his most desperate hour he was still thinking of them, and ensured that they died in freedom instead of in Roman captivity. Lucullus, who was apparently a kind and gentle man, or at least as far as anyone who commands armies can be, was deeply disturbed by this. In fact, the whole war seemed to deeply disturb him. For example, when the city of Amisus fell, the defenders had set it alight to ensure it didn't fall whole into Roman hands. Lucullus apparently walked the streets, begging his men to help him put out the fires and carry aid to the suffering civilians. But Lucullus was an aristocrat, and a haughty, arrogant one at that. He had no connection with the average legionary, or any idea why they fought. These men were born with nothing, or next to nothing, and they joined the Roman army because of the promise that they could keep whatever they took. And they planned to take. Looting, rape, plunder, and death stalked the streets of Amisus. Witnessing his army's most destructive tendencies brought Lucullus to tears, and he cried to his friends that he was so jealous of his old general Sulla, who had been able to prevent his army from burning Athens to the ground. Lucullus would later try and right the wrong that he was complicit in. He had Amisus rebuilt and repopulated, and when he heard a story that Alexander the Great had once liberated the town from Persian rule and given it a democratic government, he gave Amisus a democracy to govern itself with. You see, Mithridates isn't the only one trying to emulate Alexander. Basically everyone in this time period is trying to be Alexander the Great. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in history who more people haven't wanted to be. The Mithridatic War was won, at least as far as Lucullus was concerned. Sure, Mithridates is still on the loose somewhere, but he has no kingdom, no army, and no power. Pontus is now a Roman possession, and the king's son, Machares, the ruler of Crimea, sent a golden crown to Lucullus as a symbol of supplication. With Asia now completely under his command, Lucullus began governing his new province. And he was an upright and just sort of man, so he started arresting criminals, fighting corruption, freeing slaves, forgiving debts, and basically undoing all of the horrors that had smeared Rome's reputation in the eyes of these people for the last few decades. Mithridates was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Mithridates began planning his comeback. Again. Sure, things did look pretty bleak. His kingdom was gone, his armies were smashed, his family were either dead or had defected to Lucullus, one of his last remaining friends, Dorilaus, was also gone. But it took more than that to stop Mithridates the Great. He still had one remaining powerful ally that he could turn to, his son-in-law, Tigranes of Armenia. King Tigranes accepted his father-in-law's request for sanctuary, but not much else. He wasn't interested in helping him fight the Romans. He took Mithridates and tucked him away in a quiet little corner of Armenia and just kept him there for a year and a half, not even deigning to go and speak with him. Tigranes wasn't interested in a war with Rome. He was doing his own thing. He had brought all of this territory under his control and was building his own empire. However, at some point in the year 69, BCE, he received news that a Roman envoy was coming to speak to him. Tigranes didn't really take the Romans particularly seriously, so he had his men lead their ambassador, a guy called Appius Clodius, round and round and round the Syrian desert, just hoping that the Roman would get bored and go home, or perhaps take the hint that the King of Kings was not interested in having words with him. But Clodius had with him a freedman, an emancipated slave, who was a native to this area of Syria, and pointed out fairly early on that this scenic route round the Syrian desert was clearly nothing more than a stalling tactic. So with the freedman as guide, Clodius made his way directly to the city of Antioch and the court of King Tigranes. Tigranes was a real king of kings, like in the old style. Plutarch tells us that years of success and power have made him arrogant and narcissistic. He had learned not only to covet the world, not only to rule the world, but to believe wholeheartedly that the world existed for his very sake. He made a habit of making the great lords and magnates of his land run alongside his horse when he went riding, and his court was full of people who just lived to flatter him and show supplication to him in the most obvious ways possible. But Clodius was a Roman, and the Romans had no time for traditions other than their own, and perhaps a few Greek ones, and they especially had no time for kings. The prouder the king, the more joy the Romans took in acting insolently in front of them, and Clodius must have relished the chance. He casually strolled up to Tigranes, called him by his name, and insisted that the Armenians hand over Mithridates or risk war with Rome. All the onlookers were astonished. This Roman hadn't bowed, he hadn't flattered the king, he hadn't even deigned to call him by all of his titles. And Plutarch tells us that Tigranes completely failed to hide his astonishment and anger at this. It had been 25 years since anyone had spoken plainly in front of him. Tigranes responded with a refusal. He would not hand Mithridates over. He also had a passive-aggressive correction to make. Lucullus has been referring to him as King Tigranes. The proper title is King of Kings, not just king. So could you let him know that, please? And then, as was custom for him, Tigranes offered the Roman a massive pile of treasure as a thanks for coming along. But Clodius refused the gifts. It wasn't Roman custom to accept them, but someone informed him that it would be considered very rude if he refused all the gifts outright. So Clodius plucked a single modest bowl from the pile, thanked the king, and was on his way. Tigranes, who did not understand the Romans at all, as will become abundantly clear, sat back and relaxed. That's that taken care of, he must have thought to himself. There's no way that the Romans will follow through on that threat of war. That would be ridiculous. I command hundreds of thousands of men, and last I heard, Lucullus had about 30,000 legionaries. So there's no way that they'd do something as stupid as invade my massive empire with their tiny force. Not long after that, a messenger arrived, bearing the news that Lucullus had crossed to the Euphrates River and was invading Tigranes' territory. The Romans were coming. Tigranes couldn't stand for that. He had the messenger beheaded on the spot. That was the only suitable punishment for spreading such lies. What was this messenger's game anyway? Did he hope to spread panic in Armenia by making up this ridiculous tale about a Roman invasion? Plutarch, who's our main source for this bit of the story, was a moralistic writer. He wrote biographies of great men throughout history, trying to come to some conclusion about what it was about them that made them great, and what fatal flaws led to their downfall. As a result, he goes on nice long tirades about the arrogance of Tigranes. He says that just as some men can't consume great quantities of alcohol without losing their senses, others can't endure great prosperity without losing theirs. Tigranes had lived a life of unparalleled success. His kingdom had grown great and powerful under his rule, and as a result, he was content to surround himself with flatterers, with sycophants, with people who would never dare to warn him about any potential weaknesses in his kingdom, lest that warning be construed as an insult and they end up being killed, just like the poor messenger who bore news of the Roman invasion. But as it turns out, Lucullus had indeed invaded, and with only half his army. After leaving a garrison in Asia, he came into Armenia with only 15,000 men. And eventually, Tigranes had to accept the fact that the Romans were in fact coming. This came when Lucullus attempted to besiege his capital city of Tigranocerta, which Tigranes had built for himself and named after himself, as if you didn't need any more evidence that this guy was a wee bit narcissistic. When he heard about this Roman invasion, Mithridates sent word to his son-in-law saying, "Look, I'm coming to help, just wait there, whatever you do, don't engage the Romans in a pitched battle. I know it's tempting, because you probably outnumber them like 10 to 1, and it probably looks like it's going to be really easy, but I promise you, you don't want to let them engage in battle on their own terms. Just wait there, hold fast, I'll be there any minute." Tigranes ignored the advice of his dethroned father-in-law. He didn't need it, his army was huge. According to Appian, 250,000 infantry and 50,000 horsemen, which, even if those numbers are exaggerated, which they probably are, was still an enormous amount of men. When he spotted Lucullus's much, much smaller army, Tigranes remarked, if they've come as ambassadors, they've sent too many. If they've come as invaders, too few. Famous last words right there. The Battle of Tigranocerta would be Lucullus's finest hour. The Roman general, who had never been particularly popular with the average soldier, won their respect and admiration that day, when he ordered them to cross the river between them and the enemy and attack the Armenians. One of his officers advised him to wait. It was the 6th of October, which is an unlucky day in the Roman calendar. But Lucullus just drew his sword and said, "Well, then we will make it a lucky day. Soldiers, victory is ours." Lucullus advanced, and as he did so, he led his left flank on a wide flanking maneuver around the enemy. Tigranes spotted this and, mistaking it for a retreat, began mocking the Romans for running away before battle was even joined.
Then the Roman line charged the Armenians, and Lucullus himself, leading the flanking maneuver, appeared from the hills on Tigranes' far right, and they fell on his cataphracts. Cataphracts were the core of the Armenian army, heavy cavalry who fought head to toe in armour, with their horses armoured also. They were kind of like ancient knights, who would charge the enemy on their massive horses and scatter them on the ends of their lances. But they had been caught stationary, and with the Romans upon them in minutes, they had no time to form up and charge. At that point, they were just men on horses. The cataphracts began to fall back, then retreat, and then run. In doing so, they trampled their own army, causing panic. Tigranes' force began to melt away. The King of Kings himself froze, in complete shock and disbelief as his army disintegrated around him. He just sat there, staring blankly,
and repeating the words, "Are they really attacking us?" Someone eventually convinced the king that he needed to move, and he ended up fleeing along with the rest of his men. Lucullus was triumphant, and he basked in the glory of his finest hour. He had shown the world and the history books the extent of his strategic brilliance. Plutarch says of him,
"The Roman generals who were most capable and most experienced in war praised Lucullus for this, that he outgeneraled 2 kings, who were most distinguished and powerful by 2 most opposite tactics, speed and slowness. For he used up Mithridates at the height of his power by long delays, but crushed Tigranes by the speed of his operations, being one of the few generals of all time to use delay for greater achievement and boldness for greater safety."
Sadly, he was, like his patron Sulla, destined to fall at the height of his fortunes. Lucullus was a brilliant general, but a disagreeable man, and unlike Sulla, he had never managed to endear himself to the common legionary. He was too noble, blue-blooded, and arrogant to really connect with them or understand their motivations. The Roman army in the east had endured years of war, brutal campaigns, starvation, disease, and battles. And in the winter of 68 BCE, the Fimbrian legions, those inveterate troublemakers, mutinied. This might not have been the end for Lucullus had he not also been undermined at home. Despite being one of them, even his fellow aristocrats found him to be a bit too haughty, a bit too self-important, and a bit too arrogant, and they never liked him. What's worse, they envied him. He had been incredibly successful, and he'd covered himself in glory and riches in the east. The wars in the west were all over. Spain was pacified. Sertorius was dead. The gladiator army, led by Spartacus, had been smashed, and the rebels had all been crucified along the Appian Way. All of those soldiers and generals were no longer tied down, and they looked east with watering mouths. The populares in Rome, who were resurgent after the death of Sulla, condemned his war in Armenia as illegal. The Senate hadn't heard anything about it. He hadn't been ordered to invade Armenia. You can't just start wars with Eastern empires on a whim, so they stripped Lucullus of his authority. And that is how Lucius Licinius Lucullus leaves our story. At the height of his glory and achievement, he's done in by a mutiny, and he's replaced by yet another of Sulla's lieutenants, a guy called Pompey. But we'll get back to him later. Back in Armenia, Mithridates was travelling to meet up with Tigranes. If the king had taken his advice, he wouldn't have engaged the Romans yet, and the 2 of them would have time to plan and figure out a strategy. This illusion was shattered when he ran into thousands of refugees fleeing northwards. So Mithridates galloped up and down the line, trying to find his son-in-law. He finally found the king without any attendants or a crown, sitting on the side of the road. Mithridates dismounted and embraced Tigranes, and the 2 men had a good long cry about their shared misfortunes. Mithridates then took off his own royal garb and dressed Tigranes in it, reassuring him that there was no point dwelling on the past. The future was all that mattered. With Lucullus distracted by this mutiny, Mithridates took the opportunity to reform his army a little bit. These years of war had taught him the pointlessness of gathering huge hordes. They were just more mouths to feed, and they had a tendency to run at the first sign of trouble. So he gathered together a small, very, very elite force and trained them. He then took the best half of that force and dismissed the rest, until he had a very, very small army, but a very, very, very good one, and one that was very loyal and mostly mounted. In the winter, when the Romans were mostly locked away in their camps, Mithridates did something daring. Without warning, he blitzkrieged through the Roman garrisons in Pontus and retook his old country. He was king of Pontus yet again. However, the king was also, for the first time, leading his army from the front. He was also in his late 60s, and this came with risks. In one early battle, an archer shot him in the face with an arrow, and a slinger sent a stone into his knee. The arrow in particular very nearly cost him his eyesight, but luckily all those years of studying pharmacology and medicine weren't for nothing, and with the help of healers from the Agari tribe of Scythians, Mithridates made a full recovery, just in time for him to receive another wound. During one battle, Mithridates won against the Romans by leading a massive cavalry charge, but he was spotted by a Roman centurion who fancied his luck at killing the king, and slashed at his thigh with a sword. The wound bled pretty heavily. Much of his army believed Mithridates dead, or about to die, and they were ready to desert and run. But luckily his physician managed to stop the bleeding, save the king's life, and then his men held him up for all to see, to inspire his men to keep on fighting, or something like that. Either way, it's a good emulation of what happened to Alexander after he was wounded in India. So in yet another way, Mithridates was just cosplaying as Alexander. Mithridates had made yet another astonishing comeback. His home country was his again, and Tigranes still ruled in Armenia. Together, they might still be able to crush the Romans and drive them from Asia. But the Romans were now led by Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, yet another person desperate to be Alexander the Great. Like Mithridates, he too is emulating the iconic haircut. Lucullus had obviously not been happy about this. Apparently, when the time came for him to formally hand over his authority to Pompey, the meeting had turned so venomous that the two generals had to be physically separated. Pompey immediately moved against Mithridates, who retreated. He'd learned his lessons. He wasn't going to allow the Romans to engage him in a pitched battle on their own terms. Instead, he planned to draw them further and further into his country and then attack when the time was right. But Pompey was quick and determined to not let the king get away. So while the Pontic army was encamped, his army advanced under the cover of darkness at midnight. Night battles are pretty unusual in antiquity. They're not unheard of by any means, but the darkness of nighttime makes them risky and confusing. Pompey used this to his advantage. His men advanced with the moon behind them, the only source of light turning them into long shadows. Mithridates' force had a hard time telling how far away they were, so their arrows and javelins all fell short. When the battle closed, the legions butchered Mithridates' men. Pompey was determined that the king wouldn't escape this time, so he had his legions fan out and surround the camp. Mithridates, seeing that he was surrounded, was determined to fight his way out, so he gathered 800 horsemen and he charged the Roman lines. They managed to break through, but they were dispersed in doing so. When the king finally fled the field, he only had 3 companions left to him. Everyone else had been scattered in all directions. Mithridates had lost his army again. He had lost his kingdom again, and he was on the run again. But this time, Armenia would not provide a safe haven. Tigranes made his way to the Roman camp, where the man who had once been so proud that he had chastised the Romans for referring to him as a mere king when he was king of kings, was ordered to dismount at the gate. No one, absolutely no one, was permitted to ride a horse in a Roman camp. In a move that shows just how far he'd fallen since those proud years when he had made the nobles run alongside his horse, Tigranes obeyed and dismounted. He then went to Pompey, fell to his knees, removed his sword and diadem, and began to cry. Pompey picked up the pitiful king and informed him that he would continue to rule Armenia on Rome's behalf. He would keep his throne, but not his empire, or really his independence. And with that, the ancient kingdom of Armenia, until moments ago the most powerful empire in the East, was reduced to the status of a vassal kingdom, existing at the pleasure of its Roman patron. Mithridates was now well and truly on the run. He had no fortress left to make a stand at. He had no powerful ally who might offer him safe haven. So he ran north to the Caucasus Mountains and the great grass sea that lay beyond them. Mithridates endeavoured to cross the mountain range, an enormous feat that he was pretty certain would slow any pursuing Romans. Once he was spat out of the other side, he would make his way to perhaps the last place on earth that he might be safe, the Crimea. A few years previously, when Lucullus had smashed his army and taken Pontus for the first time, Machares, who was Mithridates' son, who ruled the Crimea in his name, had made a public submission to Rome. So when he heard that his father was fast approaching, Machares started sending him letters saying, No, I didn't abandon you. I didn't surrender properly. I definitely didn't betray you. I was just doing what was necessary. Surely you understand. Mithridates sent no response, which could only mean one thing. The king had never been shy about shedding a few close family members if he felt they posed a threat to him. So Machares fled, burning his own fleet in the process so it wouldn't fall into his father's hands. But eventually, probably reckoning that he couldn't run forever, he killed himself. And this left Mithridates free to assume the throne of the Bosporan kingdom, the cluster of Greek cities and Scythian tribes that dotted the north coast of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Pompey stopped chasing him at Colchis. The mountain tribes of the region had just posed too much of a challenge. Like Lucullus before him, he just assumed that Mithridates was beaten without having actually captured the king. Mithridates could only watch from afar, from across the Black Sea, as Pompey reorganized his old kingdom into a proper Roman province, even founding a city on the site where he had defeated Mithridates' army, calling it Nicopolis, or Victory City. Pompey also unearthed the remaining hidden treasuries that Mithridates had around Pontus. This he did with the help of Mithridates' wife Stratonike, who had survived the massacre at Cabira. Seeing that her husband's cause was obviously lost, Stratonike negotiated with Pompey, saying that she would show him the remaining hidden stashes that Mithridates had around the country, in exchange for a promise that her son by the king, Xiphares, would be spared once the war was over. And Pompey agreed. Furious at his wife's betrayal, Mithridates would rid himself of yet another son. He put Xiphares to death, just to spite her. But Mithridates himself then sent word to Pompey, asking him for a peace deal in which he might be able to retain his ancestral kingdom. And Pompey said that he would consider this if the king would come and negotiate with him in person. But the king refused, saying that he would send some of his remaining sons to negotiate instead. But as always with Mithridates, this was just a ruse. Play diplomacy with the Romans to buy time to make preparations for his new war. Mithridates began levying heavy taxes on his new kingdom to pay for mercenaries. Entire forests were cut down for their timber, and livestock were slaughtered for their sinews, so that great war machines could be constructed. A brand new strategy was devised, a bold one. Some might even say completely unrealistic. Mithridates would march his new army across the entirety of Eastern Europe, join up with the Gauls, cross the Alps as Hannibal had once done, and attack the Romans on their home turf in Italy. This is what all these new preparations were for. The 70-year-old king would lead the longest and most daring march in the annals of military history to finally take the war to the Romans. But, unlike before, Mithridates wouldn't oversee the preparations himself. He was taken sick. Very sick. His face had become covered in painful ulcers, and he was bedridden, attended only by his eunuchs. These ulcers could have been the result of a number of things. The Caucasus Mountains and the southern steppe get very cold, and their air is famous for being harsh on the face and skin of those who aren't used to it. Frostbite was a very real concern. Mithridates was also famously promiscuous, with loads of wives, loads of concubines, and an honestly unreasonable number of children. With all that sleeping round, it's possible that he'd contracted a sexually transmitted infection. Now, I don't want to open the massive can of worms that is whether or not syphilis was prevalent in pre-Columbian Eurasia, but if it was, syphilis is a real contender. As well as face ulcers, syphilis is also known to affect the cognitive faculties of those that it infects, which might go some way in explaining his frankly deranged plan to march across the whole of Europe. There are other diseases too that might be the culprit, but I choose to believe the most poetic cause. Adrian Mayer considers the possibilities in her book, and suggests that the king's most famous habit might have contributed to his ill health. Regularly ingesting arsenic can lead to a number of skin problems, including skin cancer, which is exacerbated massively by frostbite. If the king truly did ingest arsenic on a daily basis, the immunity he built up might have come at the cost of his long-term health. But by being locked away, bedridden and sick, Mithridates was denying his new subjects a chance to see him, and this had been a crucial part of his leadership beforehand. He was ever the showman, leading from the front, standing before his people and showing them firsthand why he was worth following. Instead, the people of the Bosphorus never saw their king. They only heard that he was locked away with his untrustworthy eunuchs. They had no one to turn to, no one who might relieve their sufferings. These taxes were ruinous, their livestock had been requisitioned and killed, and their sons were being pressed into military service for a war that they all thought would end badly. And the whispering got louder. The king is insane. He's lost his mind. He's leading us to suicide. Does he really think that he can invade Italy and defeat the Romans there, when he couldn't even defeat them in his own country? No, he knows that his life is coming to an end, and he wishes to die in noble battle as opposed to shameful exile. But he plans on taking all of us with him. Mithridates doesn't seem to have considered just how much his own people were turning against him until some of them acted. A number of the king's younger children were residing in the city of Phanagoria, and one night the citizens, in protest of the king's high taxes, took them hostage. And they all went willingly, they didn't put up a fight, apart from one. One of Mithridates' daughters tried to resist, a girl called Cleopatra. Different to Mithridates' other daughter, Cleopatra, who married Tigranes of Armenia. Also, still no relation to the more famous Cleopatra of Egypt. God, if I had this many children, I'd kill half of them too, just to keep things simple. Mithridates sent a ship to rescue Cleopatra. But only Cleopatra. He'd heard that none of his other children had tried to resist, so he wasn't going to do anything for them. Was this yet another sign of his deteriorating mental state? Possibly. It's also very in character for Mithridates, though. He's never been shy of shedding a few family members. But the rebellion continued to spread. The people of Crimea were up in arms against Mithridates, refusing to become pawns in his new war. They cried for Pharnaces, the king's son, to be king instead. Now Mithridates had the opportunity to capture and kill Pharnaces, but he refused. Perhaps because Pharnaces was obviously his favourite son, and he often referred to him as his heir. Or maybe he thought the young man was genuinely innocent. Or perhaps, deep down, the king knew that it was all over, and he just didn't have the heart to kill another child. So Pharnaces was allowed to roam free, and he went straight outside to join the growing mob, calling for him to be king. Mithridates' personal guard deserted him shortly afterwards. But the mob of protesters outside weren't about to let these super elite and incredibly loyal soldiers, just join them. Perhaps they were still secretly working for the king. He was well known for tricks like this. But the guards soon put this speculation to rest when they went to the stables and killed all of Mithridates' horses, thereby proving their loyalty to Pharnaces, the new king that everyone was calling for, and robbing Mithridates of his only means of escape. If he hadn't already, at this point Mithridates must have accepted that it was all over. The man famous for never giving up surely must have seen that this was the end. His great ambitions would never be realized. He had lost control over his army, over his kingdom, over his own family. The only thing he had control over now was the means by which he departed. In one last desperate bid for escape, and to avoid the possibility of being handed over to the Romans, he sent messengers to his son asking for safe passage to leave. But none of those messengers ever returned. It was clear that he would never leave this tower. So this was really it, the end. Not only of his kingship, but of his life. Mithridates took a vial of poison from his hip and bid his remaining friends, family, and companions to go outside and declare their loyalty to the new king. there was no use remaining here with him. Only 2 of them stayed, 2 of his daughters, who refused to go out and make peace with their brother, instead declaring their intention to stay and die with their father. So Mithridates shared the vial of poison he had with his 2 daughters, who died very quickly. But ironically, the king's lifelong pursuit of immunity to poisons came back to bite him. Without having the full dose to himself, the poison just didn't take effect. So Mithridates took to pacing round and round the room, trying to get his blood flowing and trying to get the poison to actually have an effect on him. But it was no good. Eventually he turned to one of the only men he had left in the tower with him, a Gallic officer, and said,
"I have profited much from your right arm against my enemies. I shall profit from it most of all if you will kill me, and save from the danger of being led in a Roman triumph one who has been an autocrat so many years, and the ruler of so great a kingdom, but who is now unable to die by poison because, like a fool, he has fortified himself against the poisons of others. Although I have kept watch and ward against all the poisons that one takes with his food, I have not provided against that domestic poison, always the most dangerous to kings, the treachery of my army, children, and friends."
And so ended the life of Mithridates Euptator Dionysos in his early 70s in the city of Pantikapaean. His body was delivered to Pompey, who gave it a grand funeral. As a reward for rebelling against his father, Pharnaces was granted the kingdom of the Bosporus, which he would rule on Rome's behalf. Asia Minor, Syria, the Levant, all these other lands that had at some point or another supported Mithridates, they were all incorporated into the Roman Empire. And voila, it's ready, our antidote to all known poisons. Well, not really. Mithridates made a universal antidote, I've made spaghetti. Which, to be fair, is about the best I could do. We don't actually have Mithridates' secret formula. If it was ever written down, it was probably destroyed along with the rest of his personal papers at the disaster at Cabira. The ingredients I told you about earlier are pulled from various Roman sources, and it's unlikely any of them got it just right either. The Roman writer Pliny had access to at least one version of the recipe with 54 ingredients. Pliny mocks this as being obvious nonsense. This was, he said, the mere vanity and ostentation of scientific knowledge, the implication being that Mithridates might have thought himself a great scientific mind and pharmacologist, but he was in fact just a fool and quite possibly a drug addict. And because he was king, no one dared tell him otherwise. And maybe that's true. Or perhaps Pliny had a fake version of the recipe. If it ever existed, it would have surely been one of Mithridates' greatest weapons, and he would have had a real motivation to keep it a secret. And it wouldn't be beyond him to make fake versions of the recipe to throw people off. Or perhaps Mithridates' antidote is more of a Roman invention than a Pontic one. Imitations of Mithridates' supposed cure-all were pretty common in the Roman Empire, being peddled by physicians who had a lot to gain from it. It has been suggested that the king's near-mythical immunity to poisons and his universal antidote was little more than the invention of Roman marketing teams looking to peddle the next miracle tonic. And in that regard, spaghetti is a pretty appropriate thing to make in place of Mithridation, in that it's a Italian thing, not a Pontic one. Cynical marketing or no, the legend of Mithridates' tolerance to poisons was widespread in Rome long after his death. 100 years after the Mithridatic Wars, the Roman satirist Juvenal would quip that cold steel would make a comeback in murders if more people took inspiration from King Mithridates. But that doesn't change the fact that the recipe is no longer with us. Literally thousands before me have tried, because the idea of a universal antidote is just too damn alluring. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Islamic scholars would work tirelessly trying to recreate the recipe, and many of them believed that they cracked the code. Rulers from Charlemagne to Elizabeth I to Oliver Cromwell were all said to take daily doses of their own version of Mithridation. But few of them lasted as long as Mithridates, who was still breathing into his 70s. Whatever it was that he was taking, it certainly didn't hinder his journey to what was, at the time, a pretty old age. And living for such a long time could well be regarded as the king's greatest achievement, because pretty much everything else he did was a massive failure. Far from destroying Rome, he did little more than irritate it for a few decades. It's hard to ignore the fact that Rome never really paid Mithridates its full attention. They kind of always fought him whilst hamstrung. The phrase I see very often, although I'm not sure where it originates from, is that Rome fought Mithridates with one arm tied behind its back. Sulla's campaign against him feels more like an inconvenient chore that he had to get out of the way before he went back to Italy to fight his more important civil war. Lucullus beat him with only half an army, and Pompey just kinda cleaned up afterwards. It all just feels a bit weak, really. I mean, if there's a Rome's Greatest Enemies club in the afterlife, where all the people that made Roman lives hell get together to exchange stories, it's hard not to imagine the likes of Hannibal Barca, Attila the Hun and Brennus the Gaul, feeling that the title has been somewhat cheapened by Mithridates' admittance into their club. I can really imagine Mithridates at dinner with them, boasting about how he killed 80,000 Italians in one day, only for Hannibal to make a sarcastic remark about how he did the exact same thing, only when he did it, it was on the battlefield, and it crippled Rome's military for a generation. When Mithridates did it, he killed harmless civilians, and then Sulla chased him back to Pontus the same way a disobedient child is sent to bed. The armies of Mithridates and his friend Tigranes of Armenia utterly failed to not, on every occasion, be embarrassingly wiped out by Roman forces that were usually considerably smaller than their own. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this was explained away with the racist language that was common at the time. The historian Theodore Mommsen in the 1850s likened Mithridates to an Ottoman sultan, because the Ottoman Empire was still around at the time, and imbued him with stereotypes of Orientalism, that he was greedy, corrupt, and had delusions of grandeur. Mommsen almost paints Mithridates as being sympathetic. He couldn't help being the way he was. He was an Asian despot, and you know the way they are, and his people were just too servile to do anything except follow him mindlessly into disaster after disaster. 100 years later, in the 1950s, attitudes had changed a bit, but were still kind of tainted by the racist attitudes at the time. Historian and novelist Alfred Duggan portrays Mithridates as a kind of hero standing up against Roman imperialism, but he also portrays him as being held back by the treachery of his subjects. Cringing Asiatics, as he calls them, Mesopotamians and Arabs who were fickle by nature. I am being a tad bit harsh on these guys. These kinds of ideas and attitudes weren't that out of place at the time, but this kind of stuff still affects us today. In 2007, the film 300 came out, and the Persians were depicted as literal monsters. Like, they're not even people anymore. They're just servile orcs and the occasional person of colour throwing themselves mindlessly on the spears of the freedom-loving Spartans. What I'm saying is that we live in a more progressive age now, but the shadow of Orientalism is a long one, and we're not completely in the light yet. The Romans saw things a bit differently. They didn't explain their victories away as being a result of Oriental despotism inevitably giving way to Western freedom or whatever. That was demonstrably untrue. Plutarch makes a remark at the end of his biography of Lucullus that the ease with which Mithridates was defeated kind of lulled the Romans into a false sense of security when it came to fighting the peoples of this region. He says that the success of Lucullus inspired a fair bit of jealousy back home, and apparently it
incited Crassus to his attack upon Asia. He thought that the barbarians were spoil and booty, and nothing else. It was not long, however, before he encountered the Parthian arrows, and proved that Lucullus had won his victories not through the folly and cowardice of the enemies, but through his own daring and ability. This, however, is later history.
The Romans would never conquer that much further into Asia, not permanently anyway. It's hard to blame Mithridates' defeat on anyone except him. Why was it that Lucullus could besiege several cities and win battles with an army of 30,000, and Mithridates couldn't take one city with 100,000 men? It's because Lucullus was a great general, and Mithridates was not. Despite his failures, I think Mithridates deserves a bit more attention than he gets, in the English language at least. He pretty much always seems to appear as just a side character in someone else's story, that of Sulla, Lucullus, Pompey, etc. Which is ironic because I began this video explaining how he basically embodied main character energy. You can imagine how disappointed the people of Pontus must have been when they thought that their king was clearly the driving force of history, only to discover that they were just part of some soon-to-be-scrapped subplot to the greater story of Roman history. Partially, this is thanks to our sources. Appian does a pretty good rundown of the Mithridatic Wars, but other than that, we've only got like bits and pieces from various biographies of Plutarch and other anecdotes from sources that tend to be focused on something other than Mithridates. If you want to learn about the lives of other great figures in antiquity, like Caesar, Alexander, Sulla, things like that, they usually have large amount of texts dedicated to them. But for Mithridates, you really have to go fishing for snippets in Plutarch's biographies, in Pliny's natural history, and in various Byzantine epitomes. This doesn't mean that Mithridates has completely flown under the historical radar. There are some good works on him that are pretty accessible, the best one probably being Adrian Mayer's The Poison King, which was my first introduction of the topic in any depth, and on the rare occasion that I meet someone who's as interested in Mithridates as I am, they've probably also read it. There's lots of fun things in the book, like there's a few pages at the back dedicated to whether or not Mithridates would be diagnosed as a psychopath, which is pretty interesting and something that you wonder, especially when you think about all the close family members that he ended up killing. The psychology's a bit dated by today's standards, but it's still a fun little experiment. Mithridates' death feels like the end of an era. 500 years beforehand, the Persians had carved out a great empire. 200 years after that, Alexander destroyed that empire and built a new one. The Persians and the Macedonians ushered in a new and unique age in the East, usually called the Hellenistic Age, and it was one that was ended by the Romans. Although the last of the Hellenistic monarchs, Cleopatra, wouldn't lose her kingdom until about 30 years after Mithridates' death, Roman supremacy in the region all feels inevitable after this point. The hole that Mithridates left in the world when he died became the entrance through which the Romans came into Asia, and they would stay there as one of the supreme powers in the region for the next 700 years until a completely new people, the Arabs, led by the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, ushered in a new age. And so things changed again. History ebbs and flows, like the tides of the sea, and Mithridates was like a man standing on the shore, trying desperately to change its course. He failed, and the world that might have been gave way to a Roman world, which would in turn give way to the world that we live in now. Had things gone a little differently, I might not be saying that Mithridates represented the end of an era, but instead the beginning of one. And I, for one, can't help but imagine the old king, alone in the tower, accepting that it really was all over this time, and looking back on a life filled with death, destruction and failure, on all the friends and family that he'd lost along the way, and wondering if it was all worth it. Thank you for watching. Do-do-do-choo, ah, da-da-da.